Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we wander into the frozen spine of medieval Europe, where narrow mountain trails disappear beneath snow, sheep huddle together against screaming winds, and lonely shepherds spend entire winters farther from civilization than most modern people travel from their kitchen. You stand high above the valleys with nothing but rough wool on your back, a crooked walking staff in your hand, and several hundred deeply uncooperative sheep depending on you not to freeze solid before sunrise, which, honestly, feels like an unfair amount of responsibility for one human being with permanently damp boots. You probably will not survive this very well. At the very least, your fingers are about to become extremely acquainted with frostbite and sheep droppings at the same time, which is not the glamorous medieval fantasy people usually imagine while buying decorative swords online at 2 a.m. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, let me know your location and local time down in the comments. Somewhere out there, somebody is probably listening to this beside rain, snow, desert wind, or city traffic while you climb frozen medieval mountains in your imagination. Now, dim the lights and step carefully onto the old road, leaving the valley behind. The village disappears surprisingly quickly. At first, you still hear distant dogs barking somewhere below. A church bell drifts upward through the cold afternoon air. Wood smoke hangs faintly between the clustered rooftops beneath the mountain slopes. But with every slow step upward, those familiar sounds weaken until only the crunch of snow beneath your boots remains. Ahead of you stretches the mountain path. It twists through dark pine forests where snow gathers heavily across branches like folded white blankets. The air smells sharp and resinous. Every breath burns slightly inside your chest. Beside you, the flock shuffles nervously forward. Hundreds of woolly bodies pressing together in restless movement. Sheep are not majestic creatures. Modern paintings sometimes show shepherd life as peaceful and poetic. A handsome figure playing flute music beneath the stars while fluffy animals graze quietly nearby. Medieval reality feels much less elegant. The sheep smell damp. They constantly wander toward dangerous places. Some attempt to eat things that are clearly not food. One of them has already tried walking directly into a snowbank deep enough to disappear entirely. You pull it free with a sigh. This is your life now. For months, a widely accepted historical fact is that medieval mountain shepherds often spent entire seasons isolated from permanent settlements while guiding flocks across high grazing regions in places like the Alps, Pyrenees, Carpathians, and Scottish Highlands. Transhumance, the seasonal movement of livestock between valleys and mountains, shaped rural life across much of Europe for centuries, which sounds wonderfully cultural and traditional until you realize it basically means hiking enormous distances beside stubborn animals while carrying cheese in your pockets for survival. The daylight fades early beneath gathering clouds. You tighten your rough wool cloak closer around your shoulders. The fabric scratches your neck constantly. Medieval wool was thick, greasy, and surprisingly water-resistant because it still contained lanolin from the sheep. Comfortable not remotely, effective against mountain cold reasonably. Historians continued debating whether some isolated shepherd communities intentionally preferred mountain life over crowded village existence, or whether economic necessity simply forced poorer families into seasonal isolation. Standing here now with the icy wind sliding down the slopes around you, it is difficult to imagine anyone volunteering enthusiastically for this arrangement. Still, the mountains possess a strange beauty. Snow glows pale blue beneath the dimming sky. Ravens circle silently overhead. Far below, rivers wind through the valley like silver threads disappearing into mist. You understand why medieval people filled places like this with spirits, saints, and monsters. The landscape itself feels ancient enough to be alive. A sudden bell rings softly ahead. Not a church bell, a sheep bell. One old ewe wears an iron bell around her neck so the flock can follow her movements during storms or fog. The sound becomes oddly comforting as evening approaches. Clunk, 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 slow and steady through the forest silence. You follow it instinctively. The path steepens. Snow reaches your ankles now, sometimes your knees. The sheep struggle forward in dense clusters, steaming faintly in the freezing air. You use your staff constantly, poking drifts, testing ice, keeping animals away from narrow ledges hidden beneath snow. One mistake up here matters. A quirky detail from medieval mountain records mentions shepherds occasionally carrying small pieces of bread blessed by the local priests to protect flocks against avalanches and wolves. Not because the bread physically helped, of course, although carbohydrates never hurt anybody climbing mountains, but because survival often depended as much on morale and ritual as on practical skill. Humans like believing something watches over them during terrible weather. You probably do too. The first snowflakes begin shortly after sunset, tiny at first, then thicker. The forest darkens around you until the pine trunks resemble black pillars disappearing upward into endless shadow. Your hands ache with cold even inside wool wrappings. Somewhere farther uphill, you know an abandoned shepherd shelter waits near the winter pasture. Hopefully, assuming snow has not collapsed the roof, assuming another shepherd is not already using it. Assuming you actually remember the correct trail, which becomes less certain every passing hour. You pause beside a frozen stream while the flock crowds together nearby. Ice creaks softly beneath buried water. The mountain wind whistles through branches overhead like distant voices whispering to one another. People in medieval Europe often believed lonely wilderness contained supernatural dangers after dark. Travellers spoke nervously about spirits leading wanderers off safe roads. Some mountain communities blamed disappearances on invisible beings lurking near cliffs or glaciers. Scholars still disagree about how literally ordinary people believe such stories versus simply using them as warnings for children and travellers. Either way, standing alone in a frozen forest with daylight gone and snow thickening rapidly, you begin understanding why those tales survived so long. The dark changes your thinking. Every sound becomes suspicious. A branch cracks somewhere uphill. You stop breathing for a moment. Only silence follows. Then the soft clunk of the bell sheep again. Clunk! Clunk! The flock presses onward. You continue climbing through deepening snow while exhaustion slowly settles into your legs. Your stomach growls quietly beneath layers of wool and leather. Supper tonight will likely involve coarse bread hard enough to repair castle walls, and maybe a little smoked cheese if you ration carefully. Medieval shepherd cuisine rarely inspired poetry, yet the smell of wood smoke finally reaches you through the storm. Faint, but unmistakable. You lift your head immediately. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the trees and snowfall, waits shelter. Perhaps only a crude stone hut with a leaking roof and enough drafts to freeze soup directly inside the bowl. Still, after hours inside the mountain cold, it might as well be a royal palace. The sheep sense it too. Their pace quickens. Your own heartbeat follows, because night has fully arrived now, and the mountains become far less forgiving after dark. The smell of smoke grows stronger with every careful step uphill. Not fresh smoke, old smoke, the kind that seeps permanently into stone walls, damp wool, and human skin after months of winter fires. Somewhere beyond the curtain of falling snow, your shelter waits among the black pines. You nearly walk past it. The hut blends into the mountains so completely that only the crooked outline of its roof finally catches your eye through the storm. Thick stones form the lower walls. Pine logs support a sagging roof buried beneath snowdrifts. One side leans slightly downhill in a way that inspires very little architectural confidence. Still, compared to freezing to death beside confused sheep, it looks magnificent. The flock crowds anxiously around you as you force open the wooden door. Frozen hinges shriek into the night loud enough to wake every mountain spirit from here to the valley below. Inside, darkness. Cold air. The sharp smell of ash. You duck through the low entrance and immediately feel how tiny the shelter truly is. Medieval shepherds' huts rarely offered comfort. Most were built quickly from local stone with narrow openings designed to trap heat and survive mountain winds. Some shelters rarely allowed a man to stand upright inside. This one feels only slightly larger than a modern garden shed. Luxury. Your boots scrape across packed dirt mixed with old straw. In one corner sits a crude stone fire pit blackened by years of smoke. A wooden sleeping platform rises against the back wall. Half the roof creaks gently whenever wind presses against it. You stare upward for a moment. Please stay attached tonight. Outside, sheep bleat nervously in the storm. Your work is not finished yet. You spend the next hour guiding the flock toward a narrow enclosure built beside the hut from stacked stones and rough timber poles. Snow swirls constantly into your face while the animals stumble and complain around you. One particularly determined sheep immediately wedges itself halfway through the fence and must be pushed backward with considerable indignity for everyone involved. Mountain shepherding contains very little dignity. A well-known historical reality is that medieval shepherds often slept extremely close to their animals during winter because livestock represented survival itself. Sheep provided wool, milk, meat, and trade income. Losing even part of the flock could ruin an entire family economically, which means you now spend your evening arguing with freezing livestock while your eyelashes slowly collect ice crystals. Romantic history at its finest. Finally, the last sheep settles inside the enclosure, their warm bodies pressed together beneath falling snow, forming a shifting mass of wool and steam. The soft clunk of the bell sheep continues somewhere near the centre of the flock. Steady, comforting, alive. You return inside the hut with stiff fingers and aching legs. Snow melts slowly from your boots onto the dirt floor. The silence inside feels enormous after the wind outside. Then comes the most important task of the night. Fire. Without it, the cold seeps inward relentlessly. Medieval mountain winters killed through exhaustion as often as dramatic storms. Once the body cooled too deeply, recovery became difficult. Shepherds understood this through hard experience even if they lacked modern medical language for hypothermia. You kneel beside the old fire pit and begin working carefully. Dry moss, small twigs, a few precious scraps of kindling carried beneath your cloak specifically to keep them dry. Your flint strikes once, twice, again. Finally sparks catch inside the moss, glowing faint orange before tiny flames begin licking upward through the darkness. The relief feels immediate. Firelight spreads across the hut walls in warm gold waves. Smoke curls upward toward a narrow roof opening where some escapes outside while the rest politely remains indoors to sting your eyes for the next several months. Medieval ventilation systems were ambitious in spirit rather than execution. You extend both hands toward the flames. Pain returns slowly to your fingertips in sharp, prickling waves. Your face warms while your back remains freezing cold. The entire hut smells of smoke, damp wool, sheep lanolin, and wet leather. Honestly, not terrible considering the circumstances. Outside, snow continues falling heavily against the roof. You unpack your food carefully from a leather satchel. Dark bread, a chunk of hard cheese, dried onions, slightly salted meat tough enough to survive several historical eras unchanged. Some surviving records suggest shepherds occasionally flavoured meals with wild mountain herbs when available. Other accounts mention soups thickened with grains or chestnuts during better seasons. Historians still debate how varied shepherd diets truly were across different medieval regions because poorer rural communities left behind very few written records of daily meals. Whatever the exact menu, nobody was opening a cozy mountain bakery up here. You chew slowly while staring into the fur. Exhaustion settles deeper now that movement has stopped. Your knees ache from climbing. Your shoulders burn beneath the weight of wet wool clothing. Tiny cuts split the skin across your knuckles from cold and rough rope work. Outside the hut, wind moves through pine trees with a low hollow sound like distant ocean waves. You listen carefully. Mountain weather matters constantly. Shepherds learn to recognize storms through cloud shapes, animal behavior, wind direction, even subtle smells in the air. A sudden temperature shift could mean danger hours before snowfall arrived. Tonight the storm sounds steady rather than violent. That is good. Probably. A strange medieval tidbit survives from alpine folklore claiming some shepherds believed avalanches could be triggered by shouting, singing, or disrespectful noise near certain slopes. Entire communities sometimes cross dangerous areas in silence out of caution. Modern science, thankfully, places less blame on loud conversations and more on unstable snow layers. Still, looking out through the narrow doorway at the Black Mountain darkness, you understand why people became cautious. These slopes feel powerful enough to punish arrogance. The fire crackles softly. Your clothes steam faintly as they dry beside the flames. Smoke gathers near the rafters overhead where old soot hangs thick as velvet shadows. Somewhere inside the walls, tiny scratching sounds suggest mice have already established permanent residency long before your arrival. Wonderful. You pull your wool blanket tighter around yourself and settle onto the wooden sleeping platform. The boards beneath you feel uneven and brutally hard. Medieval shepherds often stuffed bedding with straw, wool scraps, or dried grasses for insulation. Although comfort remained extremely relative. At least you're no longer standing in snow. Outside, wolves begin howling far across the mountain. The sound rises thin and eerie through the storm. The sheep react instantly. Bleating erupts from the enclosure beside the hut. Hooves shuffle anxiously against frozen ground. Your heart tightens despite yourself. Wolves rarely attacked large-guarded flocks casually, especially near human firelight. But winter hunger changed animal behavior, and you're very far from help. Scholars continue questioning how severe wolf attacks truly were during medieval winters versus how much fear became exaggerated through folklore and religious symbolism. Yet isolated shepherds across Europe consistently described wolves as one of their greatest dangers. Lying here now beside a fading fire while distant howls drift through the snow, exaggeration feels less important than immediate reality. The mountains outside remain vast, cold, hungry, and morning still feels impossibly far away. Morning arrives slowly through grey light leaking between the roof beams. You wake stiff, smoky, and deeply uncertain whether your blanket helped at all during the night. Every joint complains when you sit upright. The fire has collapsed into faint red embers beneath white ash. Cold air presses against your face immediately, as if the mountain spent the entire night waiting patiently for your tiny shelter to weaken. Outside, the sheep are already awake. You hear them before opening the door, soft bleating, hooves scraping frozen ground, the steady clunk of the bell sheep somewhere beyond the walls. You pull your wool cloak around your shoulders and step into the morning snow. The cold hits instantly, sharp enough to sting your teeth when you inhale. Fresh snowfall blankets everything in pale silver layers. Pine branches sag heavily overhead beneath thick white drifts. The world feels silent except for animals and wind. A practical historical fact often overlooked is that medieval shepherds spent enormous amounts of time simply preventing livestock from dying through exposure. Winter grazing required constant movement, careful sheltering, and endless observation. Sheep could survive cold surprisingly well thanks to thick wool, but starvation, wet condition, and icy injuries remained constant threats, which means your glamorous morning routine begins with checking sheep hooves for frozen mud while your own nose slowly turns numb. You walk carefully through the enclosure counting animals one by one. Counting matters. Shepherds memorize flock sizes obsessively because losing even a few animals carried serious consequences. Medieval rural economies balanced precariously between survival and disaster. A dead sheep meant less wool, less milk, less trade value, less security during already difficult winters. Fortunately, every sheep appears present, Unfortunately, they also appear determined to wander in 12 different directions simultaneously. One young ram immediately attempts climbing the stone wall for reasons known only to himself and perhaps ancient forces of chaos. You guide him back down with a tired sigh. The morning passes in constant movement. You lead the flock slowly along lower mountain slopes where wind has exposed patches of frozen grass beneath the snow. The sheep spread carefully across the hillside, scraping at ice with their hooves while cold mist drifts between dark trees. Your staff never leaves your hand. You use it constantly, testing hidden ground, guiding animals, keeping balance on icy paths, occasionally waving it dramatically at sheep who clearly do not appreciate your leadership style. The mountains smell different during daylight, cleaner somehow. Sharp pine resin mixes with snow and distant smoke from unseen chimneys far below in the valleys. Ravens hop across exposed rocks watching the flock with unsettling intelligence. You chew slowly on stale bread while walking. Breakfast in the medieval mountains rarely involved joy. The bread feels hard enough to survive archaeological excavation intact. Still, food matters more than pleasure up here. Shepherds burned enormous energy climbing steep terrain in freezing temperatures while wearing heavy clothing and managing livestock hour after exhausting hour. Your body constantly demands fuel. Even now, your stomach growls again despite eating only moments earlier. A curious historical detail from some medieval alpine regions mentions shepherds rubbing animal fat onto exposed skin during severe cold. It helped protect against wind and frost damage. Although the resulting smell probably guaranteed extremely limited romantic opportunities afterward. Not that romance feels especially likely while standing knee-deep in snow beside suspicious sheep. The hours move quietly. Wind slides down the slopes in long cold breaths. Ice cracks softly beneath your boots near frozen streams. Sometimes distant avalanches rumble faintly across neighbouring peaks like muted thunder. Those sounds always make you pause. Avalanches terrified mountain communities for obvious reasons. Entire paths vanished beneath sudden snow collapses. Travellers disappeared permanently. Livestock could be buried within seconds. Medieval people often viewed avalanches almost like living punishments descending from the mountains themselves. Researchers still disagree about how much practical avalanche knowledge medieval shepherds truly possessed compared with the instinctive local experience passed orally through generations. Yet experienced herders clearly recognized dangerous slopes and seasonal warning signs long before modern snow science existed. You certainly learn caution quickly. By midday, the clouds thin slightly overhead. Weak sunlight glows across the snowfields, turning them painfully bright. The flock settles into calmer grazing now that exposed grass becomes easier to find along rocky southern slopes. You finally stop moving for a moment. The silence feels enormous. Far below, tiny villages rest beside winding rivers almost invisible through the winter haze. Smoke rises gently from distant chimneys. Somewhere down there, people gather around warm ovens, repair tools indoors, gossip beside tavern fires, and complain about taxes while remaining wonderfully protected from wolves and avalanches. Meanwhile, you're standing on a frozen mountain trying not to lose arguments with livestock. Life takes strange directions sometimes. Your fingers ache constantly despite wool wrappings. Medieval gloves existed, of course, but poorer shepherds often relied on layered cloth, rough mittens, or simple hand coverings made from sheepskin. Dexterity mattered for rope work and animal care. Yet exposed skin froze quickly in mountain weather. Nothing remains comfortably warm for long. Not boots, not hands, not even thoughts. As afternoon fades, the temperature drops sharply again. You notice it first in the sheep behaviour. They begin clustering together instinctively. Their breath steams heavily in the cold air. The bell sheep lifts a head repeatedly toward the forest as wind changes direction. Animals often sensed weather shifts earlier than humans. You trust that instinct. So you begin guiding the flock back toward the hut. The journey downhill feels slower. Snow deepens in shaded areas beneath the trees. Your legs burn from exhaustion now. Every upward slope feels unfairly steep. One exhausted sheep simply lies down in the snow halfway home and refuses movement entirely. You stare at each other for several long seconds. Eventually you drag the animal upright with all the enthusiasm of a man whose career choices suddenly deserve serious reconsideration. The forest darkens quickly around you. Pine trunks stretch upward like pillars disappearing into grey sky. Snow falls lightly again, whispering against branches overhead. Somewhere nearby, woodpeckers tap rhythmically against frozen bark. Then silence returns. Medieval shepherds spent extraordinary amounts of time alone with repetitive sounds. Bells, wind, hooves, breathing animals. Many probably developed heightened awareness of subtle noises modern people never notice inside crowded cities filled with engines and electric hum. You notice everything now too. The scrape of leather straps, the crunch beneath each boot step, the soft shifting of a sheep wool brushing together. Even your own breathing sounds louder in the cold. Back at the hut, evening settles quickly across the mountains. You rebuild the fire while smoke curls heavily through the cramped interior. The warmth arrives slowly but gratefully. Outside, darkness spreads across the snowfields once more. Inside, your damp cloak steams beside the flames. You eat another simple meal in exhausted silence while wind rattles the roof overhead. Every muscle in your body feels heavy now, yet despite the discomfort, despite the cold and hunger and endless labour, something about the mountain quiet begins changing you already. The valleys feel farther away tonight, smaller somehow, as if the world beyond these frozen slopes belongs to someone else entirely. And tomorrow, before dawn even touches the peaks, you will wake and do all of this again. Darkness settles over the mountains long before you feel ready for it. The fire burns low inside the hut, glowing orange across rough stone walls while smoke gathers thickly beneath the roof beams. Outside, snow drifts softly through the trees. Wind presses against the hut in slow, cold breaths that make the wooden walls creak every few minutes. You sit wrapped in blankets and damp wool, listening. That becomes an important part of mountain life. Listening, not because you enjoy it necessarily, but because sound carries information long before your eyes notice danger. A frightened sheep makes one kind of noise. Wind crossing frozen branches creates another. Wolves moving nearby produce silence first, then panic afterward. The mountain teaches your ears before anything else. The sheep enclosure rustles quietly outside. Hooves scrape frozen earth. Occasionally one animal bleats softly in its sleep, which sounds strangely human in the middle of the night. The bell sheep shifts somewhere near the centre of the flock. Clunk. Pause. Cluck. The rhythm comforts you more than expected. In many medieval mountain regions, shepherds worked alone for weeks at a time during difficult seasons. Surviving account books, monastery records, and rural laws all suggest that isolated herding was deeply woven into the economy of upland Europe. Entire villages depended on people willing to disappear into cold wilderness with livestock, while everyone else remained safely near ovens and church bells below. You begin suspecting those villagers were the truly intelligent ones. The fire cracks sharply. You look up immediately. Out here, sudden noises matter. A gust of wind pushes smoke downward into the hut, making your eyes sting. The smell grows heavier now. Burned pine sap, damp wool, ash, a faint sour scent from drying boots beside the flames. Honestly, medieval mountain air contains layers. You add another log carefully and settle back against the wall. Your shoulders ache from the day's climb. Tiny muscles in your hands twitch with fatigue every time you flex your fingers. Shepherd work appears peaceful from a distance, but nearly every part of it involves lifting, climbing, dragging, repairing, or walking through terrible weather beside deeply confused animals, especially the confused animals. Outside, the wind changes direction. You hear it immediately. The trees begin whispering together beyond the hut walls. Snow rattles softly against the roof. Somewhere farther upslope, something cracks loudly in the forest. Your body stiffens. Silence follows. Then another crack, just branches shifting beneath ice, probably, or snow sliding from overloaded limbs. The mountains constantly produce strange sounds after dark. Water moves beneath frozen streams, rocks split from temperature changes, ice settles with noises like distant footsteps. Even so, your imagination remains extremely active tonight. A lesser-known detail from medieval folklore tells of shepherds leaving tiny offerings near dangerous mountain passes. Sometimes bread, sometimes milk, occasionally carved wooden charms. People believed certain isolated places possessed tempers of their own and responded poorly to disrespectful travellers. You can understand the instinct. There is something unsettling about wilderness at night when no human voices exist for miles around. The darkness feels complete in a way modern people rarely experience. No lanterns flicker on distant roads, no engines hum beyond the hills, no glowing windows soften the horizon. Only mountains. Only weather, only you and the flock. You pull your blanket tighter and glance toward the narrow doorway. Snowlight reflects faintly outside, turning the landscape pale blue beneath the clouds. The forest beyond remains black and unreadable. Somewhere in those trees, wolves may already be moving. Medieval wolves occupied a far larger range across Europe than they do today. Mountain communities respected and feared them intensely during winter months when hunger drove predators closer to livestock. Shepherd dogs, fires, bells, and elevated enclosures all helped discourage attacks, but none guaranteed safety completely. Researchers continue examining how frequently wolf attacks truly occurred, compared with how often religious fear and storytelling amplified the danger. Yet one thing appears consistently in surviving records. Rural people took wolves very seriously, and so do you. A long howl rises across the mountains. Far away, thin, almost beautiful. The sheep react instantly. Nervous movement spreads through the enclosure outside like ripples through water. Hooves stamp. Low, anxious bleating fills the darkness. You sit motionless, listening. Another howl answers from farther down the valley. Then silence returns. The fire pops softly beside you while your heartbeat slowly settles again. Wolves rarely rush directly towards strong firelight and human presence, especially near large flocks protected by fences and dogs. Still, fear enters the hut now and refuses to leave entirely. Sleep becomes difficult afterward. You lie back against the wooden platforms, staring upward into smoke shadows twisting along the rafters. Every sound outside feels sharper now. The creaking roof, the shifting sheep, the hiss of falling snow. Time stretches strangely during mountain nights. Without clocks or candle abundance, people often measured darkness differently in the medieval world. Shepherds woke repeatedly to tend fires, check animals, or simply because cold prevented deep uninterrupted sleep. Historians studying pre-modern rest patterns sometimes suggest segmented sleep may have been common in many rural communities. That suddenly feels very believable. You drift lightly for a while, then wake again. The fire has dimmed lower. Cold presses inward through the walls. Your breath fogs faintly above the blanket. Outside, the storm appears calmer. Now, snow falls more gently against the roof. For a few quiet minutes, you simply listen to the mountain breathing around you. And slowly, strangely, the fear changes shape. The darkness no longer feels entirely hostile. Lonely perhaps, vast certainly, but also steady in its own ancient way. The sheep remain alive outside, the fire still burns. Snow continues falling exactly as it did yesterday and centuries before that. The mountains do not care whether you worry, they simply continue existing. An odd historical rumour circulated in parts of the Alps claiming experienced shepherds could predict storms through dreams. Some people believe the mountains whispered warnings during sleep to those who spent enough years alone among the peaks. Modern meteorology may disagree enthusiastically. Still, after enough nights isolated in frozen silence, you begin understanding how medieval people blurred the line between instinct and superstition. Human minds search constantly for patterns in dangerous environments, especially tired minds, especially lonely ones. Eventually you rise once more to feed the fire. Sparks whirl upward into darkness as fresh wood catches flame. Warmth slowly spreads back through the hut. Outside, the sheep quiet again beneath falling snow. The bell sheep shifts softly. Clunk! Clunk! You close your eyes listening to it, and somewhere far beyond the trees, hidden among endless ridges and frozen valleys, another wolf howls into the winter night. Morning comes wrapped in fog. Not ordinary valley fog drifting gently across rivers and fields. Mountain fog feels thicker, colder, alive somehow. It rolls silently between the pine trees and across the slopes until the world shrinks to only a few yards around you. The sheep hate it immediately. So do you. You stand outside the hut before sunrise, pulling your cloak tighter, while damp mist settles across your face and beard. The flock shifts nervously inside the enclosure. Shapes appear and vanish through the whiteness like ghosts made from wet wool. Only one sound remains steady. Clunk! Clunk! The bell sheep. Without that iron bell, you would lose half the flock before breakfast. Generations of medieval shepherds relied on led animals fitted with bells to guide movement during storms, fog or darkness. The sound helped both sheep and humans maintain direction when visibility collapsed. Different bell tones even allowed experienced herders to recognize specific animals from a distance, which means one slightly grumpy ewe has effectively become your mountain navigation system. You open the enclosure carefully and the sheep spill outward into the fog in a slow, crowded mass. Steam rises faintly from their backs. Their hooves crunch through crusted snow, while the bell continues sounding somewhere near the front. You follow instinctively. The mountain trail curves upward through the scattered rocks and twisted pine roots hidden beneath snow. Every few steps you probe ahead using your staff because fog conceals dangerous drops surprisingly well. Medieval mountain routes rarely included safety railings, warning signs, or helpful painted markers explaining that death waited immediately beyond the next icy ledge. The medieval approach to workplace safety was refreshingly optimistic. Cold moisture gathers inside your gloves. Your boots feel permanently wet now, somewhere above the fog. Pale morning light glows faintly through clouds, but down here the world remains silver-grey and silent. Except for sheep. Always sheep. A few lambs bleat anxiously while pushing close beside older animals. The larger rams move more confidently, lowering their heads against the wind as if personally offended by the entire weather system. You cannot blame them. The climb grows steeper as the morning passes. Snow thickens around exposed ridges where drifting winds piled it shoulder deep during earlier storms. The flock slows constantly. Some sheep sink nearly to their bellies, crossing uneven drifts. You pull one free. Then another. Then the exact same sheep somehow traps itself again 5 minutes later. Patience becomes one of the most valuable survival skills in mountain shepherding. Not courage, not strength. Patience. The ability to repeat exhausting tasks calmly while cold, hungry and surrounded by animals making deeply questionable decisions. Several surviving legal codes from medieval Europe actually included detailed rules governing shared grazing routes and seasonal livestock movement. Mountain paths were economically vital enough that communities argued fiercely over access rights, tolls, and grazing boundaries. Even up here, surrounded by wilderness, paperwork still haunted humanity. The fog shifts briefly around midday, revealing part of the valley far below. Sunlight flashes faintly across frozen rivers winding through distant forests. Tiny villages cling to the landscape like scattered pebbles beside white fields. Then the mist closes again. You continue following the bell. Clunk, clunk. The sound becomes strangely hypnotic after hours of walking. Your thoughts begin matching its rhythm. Step, breath, bell, snow, step, breath, bell. Mountain life strips existence down to repetitive essentials surprisingly quickly. A peculiar folk belief from parts of the Carpathian Mountain claimed certain shepherd bells could repel evil spirits if forged during particular religious feast days. Some bells were even marked with tiny crosses or symbols meant to protect both flock and herder during lonely winter journeys. Of course, bells also frightened predators and prevented sheep from wandering off cliffs, which turns out to be equally useful. You stop briefly beside a cluster of black rocks protruding through the snow like broken teeth. Wind whips across the ridge carrying the smell of ice and distant pine forests. Your face burns from cold exposure. Tiny snow crystals cling to your eyelashes every time you blink. You chew another piece of hard bread while staring into the fog. The mountains feel endless today. No roads, no villages, no comforting church bells drifting upward from below. Only whiteness and the steady movement of animals through silence. Some historians propose that isolated shepherds developed unusually strong memory skills because navigating mountain routes required remembering countless hidden landmarks buried beneath snow for much of the year. A single misplaced turn during winter storms could separate flocks permanently from safe trails. You begin noticing how carefully your mind studies everything now. The angle of wind against your face, the shape of exposed stones, the direction snow gathers beneath trees. Even the sheep sense pathways invisible to outsiders. They hesitate near unstable slopes, move carefully across hidden ice, cluster instinctively where ground remains safer beneath the snowpack. Animals survive by noticing details humans often ignore. By late afternoon, the fog finally thins. Dark mountain ridges emerge slowly around you, rising enormous against pale sky. Far ahead, narrow passes cut between jagged peaks where older migration routes continue deeper into the highlands. That is tomorrow's problem. For now, you need shelter before darkness arrives again. The flock seems exhausted too. Their pace slows noticeably, descending toward a lower, sheltered hollow surrounded by pines. Snow here lies calmer and less windblown. A narrow stream moves beneath thick ice nearby, producing soft, muffled cracking sounds under the frozen surface. You decide to camp here tonight instead of risking the higher ridge after sunset. Wise decision. Probably. You gather fallen branches while the sheep settle together among the trees. Your hands ache constantly now from cold labour. Even simple tasks require effort after hours in freezing air. By the time firelight finally flickers between the trunks, your shoulders feel heavy as stone. The flames glow beautifully against the snow. Orange, gold, alive. You warm your hands slowly while evening shadows deepen across the forest. The sheep quiet nearby. Smoke drifts upward through dark branches carrying the familiar scent of pine resin and ash. Then you hear it. Not wolves this time. A bell. Far away. Faint. Another flock somewhere beyond the trees moving through the mountains like you. For several moments you sit perfectly still listening to that distant iron sound drift through the cold air. Another shepherd survives out there tonight beneath the same dark sky. Another fire burns somewhere beyond the ridge. The feeling comforts you unexpectedly, because the mountains are vast enough to make a human feel invisible, but not entirely alone. The next morning begins with hunger. Not dramatic starvation exactly, nothing poetic or noble, just the slow, heavy awareness that your stomach remains unsatisfied no matter how carefully you ration food beside the fire each night. Mountain cold does that. The body burns through energy constantly while climbing ridges, digging paths through snow and keeping itself warm against endless freezing wind. Medieval shepherds often consumed surprisingly large amounts of bread, cheese, and animal fat simply because survival demanded calories wherever they could be found, and yet breakfast still somehow feels disappointing. You sit beside the small fire chewing another piece of coarse black bread, while snow melts inside an iron pot nearby. The bread tastes smoky and sour, hard enough that you briefly consider using it as construction material. Beside you rests a wedge of sheep cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, greasy, salty, sharp-smelling, enough to frighten weaker souls. Perfect mountain food. Outside the trees creak gently beneath pale dawn light. The flock waits restlessly among the snowdrifts, stamping frozen ground while steam rises from woolly backs into the morning air. You tear off another bite slowly. Food must last. Many shepherds' communities prepared durable winter provisions months ahead of seasonal migrations. Hard cheeses travelled well through cold climates. Dense rye breads resisted spoilage longer than softer loaves. Smoked meats and dried onions provided precious flavour during long isolated weeks in the mountains. Nobody was enjoying cinnamon pastries beside these campfires. You finish eating and immediately remain hungry. Wonderful! The sheep moved slowly this morning. Overnight frost hardened the snow surface into brittle crusts that crack sharply beneath every hoofstep. Thin sunlight spreads across the mountains now, turning the ridges pale gold against the cold sky. For a little while, the world almost looks welcoming. Then wind slides down from the higher slopes and reminds you exactly where you are. You guide the flock along a narrow path curving beside a frozen ravine. Ice glitters far below between black stones where water still moves beneath the surface. The bell sheep lead steadily ahead while the rest follow in dense nervous clusters. Clunk, crunch, clunk, crunch. Your life now operates mostly through repetitive sounds. A curious custom recorded in some alpine regions described shepherds carrying tiny cloth bags filled with salt and herbs during long journeys. People believed the mixture protected against illness and exhaustion during the harsh weather. Whether the herbs helped medically or simply boosted morale remains uncertain. But after several freezing weeks in the mountains, you begin understanding why anyone would cling desperately to small comforts. Even pleasant smells feel luxurious up here. Around midday, you stop beside a rocky outcrop sheltered from the wind. The sheep scrape through thinner snow, searching for grass while you prepare a crude meal using melted snow and scraps of onion floating inside hot water. Technically soup, emotionally more complicated. Still, warmth matters. You hold the steaming bowl carefully between stiff hands while the cold air bites at your face. The smell of onions rises softly into the mountain silence. Ravens circle overhead, watching with the confidence of creatures fully aware they will inherit this landscape long after humans disappear. Some surviving household accounts from medieval monasteries suggest shepherds occasionally received extra food allowances during especially severe winters because mountain work consumed extraordinary physical energy. Rural labourers understood very clearly that cold weather required more fuel inside the body. Your stomach agrees enthusiastically. As afternoon drifts onward, clouds gather once more along the higher peaks. Shadows move slowly across the snowfields. The flock becomes restless again, sensing weather changes before you fully notice them. Animals always know first. One old ewe suddenly refuses crossing a narrow stretch of icy ground. She plants herself stubbornly in the place while the others crowd behind her in confusion. You sigh deeply, then test the snow yourself using the staff. The surface cracks immediately. Beneath the fresh layer lies hidden ice covering part of the trail. You stare at the sheep for a long moment. Fair enough. You lead the flock carefully around the dangerous section instead, climbing awkwardly over exposed rocks while snow slides beneath your boots. The sheep follow reluctantly, bleating complaints the entire way. Nobody enjoys deep tours in winter mountains. Academic discussions about medieval shepherd life often focus on economics, trade routes, and seasonal migration patterns. Yet daily survival probably depended just as much on accumulated practical instincts like reading animal behaviour, or recognizing unsafe terrain from subtle changes in snow texture. Tiny decisions mattered constantly. One wrong path, one hidden patch of ice. One storm arriving earlier than expected. The mountains punished carelessness without hesitation. By evening, your legs feel unbearably heavy. Every step through deep snow pulls against exhausted muscles. Even the sheep move more slowly now, their wool coated with frost and bits of frozen brush gathered along the trail. The smell reaches you before the shelter does. Smoke. Human smoke. You lift your head immediately. Far ahead between dark pines, Faint grey threads rise into the cold evening sky, another hut perhaps, or a charcoal burner's camp, possibly travellers using an old mountain refuge near the pass. Whatever it is, civilization exists there, which suddenly sounds wonderful. You guide the flock forward with renewed energy while twilight spreads across the slopes. The trees grow denser here. Pine needles carpet the ground beneath the snow in soft dark patches. Wind moves quietly overhead, carrying the distant scent of wood fire and damp earth. Then the hut appears. Small, stone-built, half buried in snow beneath leaning trees, but smoke curls steadily from the chimney hole. Occupied. You pause instinctively at the edge of the clearing. In the medieval mountains, strangers mattered carefully. Most travellers welcomed company during dangerous weather, but isolated regions also carried risks from thieves, deserters, or desperate wanderers. The door opens before you decide anything. Warm orange firelight spills across the snow. An old man steps outside wrapped in thick sheepskins. His beard looks almost white against the darkness. Behind him, somewhere inside the hut, you hear another sheep bell hanging near the fire. For several quiet seconds, neither of you speaks. Then the old shepherd nods once toward your exhausted flock, and just like that, after days alone among frozen ridges and endless wind, you remember what another human voice sounds like. The old shepherd's hut smells wonderfully alive. Smoke, wet wool, boiling broth, dog fur. After days of isolation among frozen ridges, the scent alone nearly overwhelms you. Warm air spills outward as the old man steps aside silently, allowing you into the shelter while snow drifts gently through the dark pines outside. Inside, the heat feels almost unreal. A fire crackles brightly in the center hearth, casting orange light across stone walls blackened by decades of smoke. Iron cooking pots hang above the flames. Bundles of drying herbs sway softly from roof beams overhead. In one corner, two enormous shepherd dogs lift their heads lazily before deciding you are too tired to be threatening. A generous assessment. Honestly, the old shepherd motions towards the fire without speaking much. Mountain people often valued silence differently than valley merchants or town priests. Words mattered less up here. Weather, animals, and survival occupied most conversations already. You sit heavily beside the flames while warmth slowly returns to your frozen hands. Pain comes with it. Sharp tingling spreads through your fingers as circulation returns. Your boots steam beside the fire. Meltwater drips steadily onto the stone floor. The old man hands you a wooden bowl filled with thick stew. You could kiss him immediately. Instead, you eat carefully, trying not to look too desperate while chunks of root vegetables and salted meat warm your entire body from the inside outward. The broth tastes smoky and rich after weeks of hard bread and melted snow. Communal shelters and monastic guest houses played an important role along certain medieval mountain routes, especially in regions crossed by seasonal herders, pilgrims, and traders. Travelers often depended on scattered refuges during winter weather, when exposure could become deadly within hours. Civilization, it turns out, sometimes survives as one warm bowl of soup beside a mountain fire. Outside, your sheep settle near the older flock already gathered behind stone walls beside the hut. The soft sound of bells drifts through the night air whenever animals shift in the snow. Clunk, clink, soft breathing. The old shepherd finally speaks while stirring the fire with a long iron rod. He asks where you came from. You answer between mouthfuls, then he nods once, as if confirming something only the mountains themselves fully understand. Conversation unfolds slowly after that. Names of valleys, weather reports, dangerous passes, which grazing routes remain buried too deeply beneath snow this season, which villages still pay fairly for wool and which ones attempt cheating exhausted shepherds too tired to argue. Some things apparently never change in human history. One fascinating custom from certain alpine communities involved shepherds carving personal symbols into wooden bowls. Staffs, or bells, so belongings could still be identified after seasonal mixing of flocks and shared mountain pastures. A surprisingly practical system considering how many identical sheep and exhausted herders wandered these routes each year. You notice carved marks all over the hut now, tiny symbols near the doorway, patterns scratched into spoons, old knife cuts along the sleeping platform, evidence of countless winters surviving here before your arrival. The dogs rise eventually and move toward the entrance. Massive animals with thick fur and broad heads built perfectly for mountain cold. One pauses beside you long enough that you notice scars crossing its muzzle beneath the firelight. Not a friendly village dog, then. Livestock Guardian breeds protected flocks from wolves, bears, and thieves across many medieval mountain regions. Some were large enough to intimidate armed travellers. Their loyalty mattered enormously because shepherds working alone could not watch animals constantly during storms or darkness. The old shepherd scratches one dog behind the ears, then points toward the door. You hear it a moment later, howling, closer tonight. The dogs leave instantly without hesitation. You glance toward the old man. He barely reacts. Apparently this qualifies as routine. Snow falls steadily outside now, softening the forest into shifting shadows beneath moonlight. Through gaps in the doorway you see the dogs circling the sheep enclosure, while low growls rumble through the cold air. The wolves never appear openly. Not tonight. Predators usually preferred easier opportunities than approaching firelit camps guarded by experienced dogs. Yet they watched constantly from beyond the trees, waiting for weakness, an injured sheep, a broken fence, a storm severe enough to separate animals from human protection. Winter rewarded patience. Modern researchers examining medieval rural records occasionally disagree about how much danger wolves truly pose compared with other threats like disease, starvation, or accidents. But isolated herders clearly organized much of their nightly routine around keeping predators away from livestock. Fear leaves habits behind. You remain beside the fire long after the meal ends. The old shepherd repairs leather straps carefully using thick thread while sparks drift upward into the smoky rafters. Outside, wind brushes gently through the pines. The hut feels ancient in the best possible way. Not comfortable exactly. The floor remains cold stone. Smoke still stings your eyes. Drafts creep through cracks in the walls whenever the wind changes direction. Yet compared with sleeping alone beside dwindling fires and endless darkness, this place feels almost luxurious. You realize how quickly loneliness alters standards. At some point the old shepherd reaches behind the sleeping platform and removes a small wooden flute. The instrument looks worn smooth from years of use. Without explanation, he begins playing softly beside the fire. Simple music, slow, mournful almost. The melody drifts through the hut while snow falls beyond the doorway, and sheep bells answer faintly outside in irregular rhythms. You lean back against the wall, listening quietly. Records from medieval literature and rural folklore often associate shepherds with music, especially pipes and flutes easily carried during long isolated journeys. Whether every real shepherd possessed musical talent remains highly questionable. Human beings exaggerate beautifully in stories. Still, tonight the music suits the mountains perfectly. The fire burns lower. Your exhaustion settles deeper now that warmth surrounds you. Heavy, pleasant tiredness spreads through your arms and legs. For the first time in days, your body stops expecting immediate danger from weather or darkness. Even the wolves remain distant now. The old shepherd finishes the tune and sets the flute aside. Neither of you speaks afterward. The silence feels companionable rather than empty. Outside, snow continues covering the mountain paths one careful layer at a time. Tomorrow those trails will wait again. The flock will need moving. The cold will return before dawn. But tonight, for a few quiet hours inside this smoky little refuge among the frozen trees, the mountains finally allow you rest. You wake to barking, deep barking, the kind that vibrates through stone walls and immediately convinces you something outside has made a terrible decision. The old shepherd is already awake. He sits near the doorway, pulling on heavy boots while one of the great dogs growls low in its throat beside him. Pale dawn light filters weakly through the smoke hole overhead. Snow still falls beyond the hut, though lighter now, drifting lazily between the trees. The barking continues, sharp, violent. You reach instinctively for your staff. The old man finally opens the door. Cold air rushes inside, carrying the smell of pine, snow, and frightened sheep. Both dogs explode into motion immediately, charging across the clearing toward the enclosure where the flock bunches tightly together in panic. Then you see movement near the forest edge. A wolf, lean, grey, watching from between the trees. It vanishes almost instantly once the dogs rush forward, disappearing so quickly you nearly wonder if exhaustion invented it. But the sheep continue bleating wildly while the dogs patrol the perimeter with stiff raised fur and steaming breath. No imagination involved there. Large guardian dogs formed one of the most important defences medieval shepherds possessed against predators. Breeds developed in mountainous regions were selected for independence, aggression toward threats, and the ability to survive brutal weather outdoors year-round beside livestock. Basically living furry fortresses with trust issues. The old shepherd whistles once sharply. The dogs slow but remain alert, pacing through the snow while staring towards the forest. You notice how massive they truly are in daylight. Thick necks, broad shoulders, heavy paws built for ice and rough terrain. One wears a collar studded with iron spikes designed to protect its throat during fights with wolves, which feels both practical and slightly terrifying. The sheep settle gradually after the danger passes. Steam rises from their crowded bodies into the cold morning air. Frost clings to wool like powdered sugar across hundreds of restless backs. You and the old shepherd begin checking the enclosure carefully for damage. Tracks circle the perimeter everywhere. Wolf tracks. Fresh. Large enough that the sight tightens something inside your chest. Predator pressure increased dramatically during harsh medieval winters, especially in upland areas where deep snow made hunting difficult for wild animals. Livestock became tempting targets whenever hunger grew severe enough, and hungry wolves apparently maintained very inconvenient schedules. The old shepherd crouches near the tracks, studying them silently. Then he points toward the trees and raises 2 fingers. 2 wolves, possibly more. Wonderful! After reinforcing part of the fence with extra timber poles, you help prepare the flock for movement again. Today the dogs travel close beside the animals instead of wandering freely ahead. Their attention never relaxes entirely. Every few minutes one pauses to sniff the wind or stare into the forest. You start doing the same. Mountain silence changes after predators appear nearby. The trees seem denser somehow. Shadows linger longer between rocks. Even ordinary sounds become suspicious. A snapping branch instantly pulls your eyes toward the woods. Usually nothing follows. Usually. A strange tradition survived in several Eastern European shepherd communities where protective dogs were sometimes blessed individually by priests before winter migrations. Some people even braided coloured ribbons into the animals' collars for luck and protection during dangerous journeys. Honestly, if any creature deserved ceremonial appreciation, it was probably the giant wolf fighting mountain dog sleeping outside in snowstorms for your benefit. The morning trail climbs steadily through dense forest where sunlight barely reaches the ground beneath towering pines. Snow muffles every footstep except the occasional crunch of hidden ice beneath your boots. The bell sheep leads forward calmly. The dogs move around the flock constantly. One ahead, one behind. Professional. Focused. Meanwhile, you nearly trip over a buried tree root after staring dramatically into the forest for too long. Not every member of this operation performs equally under pressure. Around midday, the snowfall finally stops completely. Pale winter sunlight spreads across the mountains, revealing endless ridges layered blue and white against the horizon. Wind sweeps loose snow from higher peaks and glittering clouds. Beautiful, cold enough to freeze your eyebrows solid. The flock grazes briefly along a sheltered slope while you sit against a sun-warmed rock, chewing cheese and stale bread. One of the dogs settles nearby, watching the tree line with unwavering concentration. You study the scars across its muzzle again. Old bites, old fights. Many medieval rural communities valued trained livestock dogs so highly that stealing or injuring one could result in severe legal penalties. In practical terms, losing a guardian dog might endanger an entire flock during winter migrations. The dog beside you yawns enormously, then resumes staring into the woods like a furry veteran who has seen things. Some scholars examining pastoral folklore believe shepherd dogs gradually acquired almost mythical status in mountain storytelling because isolated communities depended on them so heavily. Tales describe impossibly loyal animals guiding lost travelers through blizzards or defending flocks against supernatural creatures. Whether those stories reflected emotional attachment or simple exaggeration remains open to interpretation. Still, sitting here now beside this scarred mountain beast while distant forests whisper beneath the snow, you understand how legends begin. The afternoon passes quietly afterward. No wolves you return, only raven. Wind, the endless steady movement of sheep through frozen valleys, yet tension lingers beneath everything now. You notice the dogs noticing things, sudden scents, tiny sounds, shifting shadows beneath the trees, and gradually you begin noticing them too. By evening, the old shepherd leads you toward a narrow stone shelter built against the side of a ridge, half cave, half hut. Smoke stains blacken the rock above the entrance from decades of fires burned here by passing herders. The dogs inspect the area before allowing the flock inside the surrounding walls. Professional again. Inside the shelter, firelight soon flickers against damp stone while darkness gathers outside. Wind hums softly across the ridge above you, carrying the faint scent of snow and pine forest stretching endlessly below. The dogs remain near the entrance even after eating, always listening, always awake enough. You realize suddenly that shepherd survival rarely depended on one single skill, not strength alone, not courage, not luck. It depended on system, dogs, bells, fences, memory, routine, fire. Each small protection layered carefully against a wilderness large enough to swallow isolated humans without effort. Outside, somewhere beyond the firelight, wolves move quietly through the snow searching for weakness. Inside, the dogs lift their heads toward the darkness and keep watching. The storm arrives before dawn, not gradually, not politely. One moment the mountains lie silent beneath weak starlight, and the next the wind slams against the shelter hard enough to shake loose dust from the stone ceiling overhead. You wake instantly. So do the dogs. Outside, sheep erupt into nervous bleating while snow lashes across the ridge in furious white waves. The old shepherd rises from his blankets, already moving toward the entrance, with the weary speed of someone who has survived this exact situation many times before. The door opens briefly. Wind explodes inside. Cold air tears through the shelter carrying snowflakes, ash, and the deep roaring sound of a full mountain storm waking around you. Visibility beyond the doorway has vanished completely. Darkness and snow twist together into one endless moving wall. The old shepherd closes the door immediately. Good decision. Winter storms in medieval mountain regions killed through confusion as often as direct exposure. Travelers lost trails only yards from shelter. Livestock scattered into ravines. Snow buried familiar landmarks within hours. Entire routes disappeared beneath drifts tall enough to swallow wagons and people alike. And unfortunately, your sheep remain outside. The next hour becomes controlled chaos. You and the old shepherd fight the wind together, while reinforcing the enclosure with extra rope and timber poles. Snow blasts against your face so hard it feels like thrown sand. The dogs circle frantically around the flock, barking into the white darkness beyond the ridge. The sheep panic every few minutes. Some try forcing through the fence. Others press together so tightly they nearly trample smaller lambs beneath the mass of moving wool and fear. You shove animals back repeatedly while your boots sink deeper into rapidly rising snow. Breathing hurts now. The air feels sharp and frozen inside your lungs. Mountain blizzards created some of the most feared conditions in medieval travel. Chroniclers occasionally described storms lasting several days, trapping both people and livestock high in exposed regions without supplies or visibility. No dramatic battle scene compares particularly well with being buried alive by weather beside screaming sheep at sunrise. The wind intensifies further by midday. You can barely see the old shepherd standing a few feet away through the snow. Ice forms instantly along your cloak and beard. Every exposited patch of skin burns painfully. The dogs refuse retreat. Even during the worst gusts, they continue circling the flock, disappearing into white haze before emerging again covered in frost. Their barking sounds strange inside the storm, muffled, distant, like echoes travelling underwater. At some point you stop feeling time properly. Only movement matters now. Tie the fence, push the sheep inward, clear snow away from the entrance. Repeat. Again. One especially violent gust tears part of the enclosure loose shortly after noon. Sheep surge towards the opening immediately, driven by pure panic. For several terrible seconds, the entire flock threatens to scatter blindly across the mountainside. Then one of the dogs launches directly into the gap, massive, furious, barking hard enough to shake snow from the air itself. The sheep recoil instantly. You and the old shepherd force the fencing back into place while snow whips around your legs in thick white spirals. Your fingers barely function anymore inside frozen gloves. Rope burns cut across your palms. Still, the enclosure holds. Barely. A remarkable detail survives in a few regional folk tales describing shepherds tying themselves to fixed ropes during severe storms to avoid becoming lost, steps away from shelter. Whether this practice occurred regularly remains difficult to verify, but the idea itself makes immediate sense standing here now. The world beyond arm's reach has ceased existing. By afternoon, retreat becomes unavoidable. The flock cannot move safely. Neither can you. So the old shepherd makes a decision. You bring the sheep closer, much closer, using temporary barriers built from sled frames, branches, and loose stones. You gradually compress part of the flock against the sheltered side of the ridge near the cave entrance itself. The animals crowd together desperately, their body heat rising in visible steam clouds through the storm. The smell becomes overwhelming. Wet wool, animal breath, mud, fear. Honestly, not ideal. Yet warmth pours from the packed bodies into the freezing air. Medieval shepherds sometimes relied on livestock heat during extreme cold, especially inside cramped shelters where humans and animals occupied the same enclosed spaces. Elegant living arrangements were not a priority during survival weather. Inside the stone refuge, the fire struggles constantly against drafts and dampness. Smoke thickens beneath the ceiling until your eyes water continuously. Melted snow drips from clothing onto the floor. The dogs finally collapse near the entrance, panting heavily, while wind screams outside across the ridge. Nobody speaks much anymore. There is nothing useful left to say. You simply endure. Night falls invisibly. The storm never weakens. Darkness blends completely with snow beyond the entrance while the fire flickers low against the stone walls. Sheep press together outside in dense shifting masses, their breathing forming huge pale clouds in the freezing air. One lamb cries weakly somewhere near the rear of the enclosure. You cannot reach it safely now. The sound fades eventually beneath the wind. Scholars examining climate records and medieval settlement patterns often point towards severe winter variability as a major factor shaping mountain life. A single storm could destroy animals, isolate villages, or block critical travel routes for weeks. Nature held enormous authority over human plans. Lying beside the weak fire tonight, you understand that truth in your bones. The old shepherd finally sleeps sitting upright against the wall, wrapped in heavy furs beside the dogs. Exhaustion pulls at you too, though the storm noise makes true rest impossible. Outside, the mountains vanish entirely beneath moving white darkness. No stars, no ridges, no valleys, only wind, and somewhere beneath all that snow, hidden trails continue waiting patiently for spring to uncover them again. if spring ever remembers this place exists. By morning the storm has buried the world. Snow presses halfway up the shelter entrance. The trees outside bend beneath heavy white weight. Even sound feels softened now, muffled beneath thick drifts stretching across every ridge and hollow. The old shepherd pushes open the door with both shoulders. Cold light spills inside. For several moments neither of you speaks. The familiar trail beyond the shelter has vanished completely. No path. No tracks. Only smooth, untouched snow rolling across the mountains like frozen ocean waves. And somehow you are expected to guide hundreds of sheep through this. Wonderful. The dogs emerge first, climbing over the drifts with slow, deliberate movements while sniffing the air. One disappears briefly behind a mound of snow before reappearing farther downslope, coated almost entirely white except for its dark eyes and nose. The sheep hesitate near the enclosure. You do not blame them. Travel after major storms required extraordinary caution in medieval mountain regions. Paths used safely for generations could become lethal overnight once deep snow concealed cliffs, streams, or unstable ground. Experienced shepherds relied heavily on memory and seasonal knowledge because visible landmarks often disappeared completely during winter, which means your brain now functions as a very cold medieval map. You and the old shepherd spend the first hour digging narrow passages through the snow around the enclosure and shelter entrance. Every movement feels exhausting. The drifts reach your waist in some places. Powder pours into your boots no matter how carefully you step. The dogs keep patrolling constantly. The wolves, thankfully, remain invisible today. Clouds drift low across the higher ridges while pale sunlight flashes occasionally through breaks in the storm. Snow crystals glitter across the landscape with almost painful brightness. Your eyes ache from staring into endless white. At last the old shepherd gestures toward a slope leading eastward through scattered pines. An old route, still usable perhaps, or at least less deadly than the others. You begin moving carefully. The bell sheep leads first, as always, though today even she seems uncertain. Her iron bell sounds dull beneath the heavy snow. Clunk. Pause. Clunk. The flock follows slowly through trenches carved by your boots and the dog's broad paws. Every few yards the snow changes texture. Some places hold firm beneath your weight. Others collapse suddenly to the knee or deeper. The mountains constantly test your judgment. Several surviving mountain charters from the medieval period describe agreements between villages to maintain seasonal pathways through difficult passes. In certain regions, local communities even assigned responsibility for clearing sections of trail after severe storms. Apparently humanity has been arguing about road maintenance forever. The forest thickens around midday. Pines crowd closely together here, their lower branches forming dark tunnels beneath the snow. Wind barely reaches the ground. Everything smells damp and resinous beneath the frozen air. For the first time since the storm began, the sheep calm slightly. Shelter matters psychologically as much as physically. You pause near an exposed rock face where ancient markings appear faintly beneath layers of ice and lichen. Carved crosses, symbols, weathered initials from shepherds or travellers long dead now. The old shepherd touches one symbol briefly with gloved fingers before continuing onward. Mountain routes accumulated stories over centuries. Some passes gained reputations for luck, others for death. Travellers often mark dangerous sections with carved prayers, religious symbols, or stacked stones meant to guide future wanderers through storms. One particularly odd belief from parts of the Pyrenees claimed whistling carelessly in certain mountain passes invited destructive winds. Shepherds supposedly avoided unnecessary noise while crossing exposed ridges during winter. Considering recent weather, you decide not to test the theory. The afternoon grows colder despite sunlight. Wind returns gradually from the northern slopes, carrying loose snow through the trees in soft, glittering spirals. Your legs burn with every uphill climb now. Even breathing feels heavier at this altitude after days of storms and poor sleep. The sheep struggle too. You notice frost collecting around their mouths and noses. Smaller lambs stumble frequently through deep drifts. The dogs nudge exhausted animals upright whenever they pause too long. Without those dogs, Half this flock would already belong to the mountain. At one narrow section of trail, the old shepherd suddenly raises his hand. Stop! The flock bunches together behind you while snow hisses softly across the ridge ahead. For several quiet seconds, nothing happens. Then you hear it, a low, hollow sound beneath the snowpack. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a deep settling groan somewhere under the slope. Your stomach tightens immediately. The old shepherd changes direction without hesitation, leading the flock away from the ridge through denser forest below. Avalanche danger. Mountain communities learned through brutal experience which sounds, slopes, and weather patterns warned of unstable snow. Before scientific terminology existed, shepherds recognized danger through instinct sharpened across generations. An instinct occasionally sounds like the mountain quietly clearing its throat. You descend carefully through tangled pines while snow slips from branches overhead in sudden soft crashes. The air smells colder now evening approaches again. Evening. Far below, the forest opens suddenly into a broad hidden valley sheltered between ridges. Smoke rises faintly near its centre. Not a village exactly. More like scattered seasonal shelters clustered around frozen grazing land. Human life. The sight lifts your exhaustion instantly. You realise how much tension has lived inside your body since the storm began. Every frozen muscle loosens slightly at the sight of smoke curling peacefully into the pale sky. The old shepherd glances toward you, almost smiling, as darkness settles across the valley. Bells begin sounding faintly from several directions at once. Other flocks, other shepherds surviving the same winter among these mountains. The sound drifts gently through the evening air. Clunk, clink, clunk, ancient and steady, and for the first time in many days. The old paths beneath the snow have finally carried you somewhere safe. The hidden valley changes something inside your mind. Not immediately. At first, it simply feels like relief. Shelter from the wind, other fires burning nearby, human voices drifting faintly through the cold evening air. The flock settles more calmly among the clustered stone enclosures while the dogs finally relax enough to sleep properly beside the walls. But after several days here, another feeling slowly emerges. Stillness. The mountains have begun reshaping your sense of time. Morning arrives quietly in the valley. Thin smoke rises from low chimneys while frost sparkles across the snowfields between the shelters. Shepherds move slowly through the pale dawn carrying buckets, ropes, and armfuls of firewood. Sheep bells sound from every direction now, blending together into one soft, irregular rhythm that drifts constantly through the cold air. Clink, clunk, pause, clink. You stop noticing the sound after a while, then suddenly notice its absence whenever silence falls. The valley itself barely deserves the name settlement. Only a scattering of rough huts and storage sheds built against the slopes beneath towering ridges. No church tower, no market square, no permanent roads. Most of these shelters stand empty outside migration seasons. Temporary lives for temporary survival. Archaeological evidence from upland Europe shows that seasonal shepherded settlements often remained extremely simple for centuries. Stone foundations, storage pits, animal pens, and smoke-blackened shelters appear again and again across mountain regions where herders returned year after year following ancient grazing cycles. Human beings are remarkably consistent once they discover a system that keeps them alive. You begin helping with ordinary routines almost immediately. Cutting wood, melting snow, repairing fencing damaged by storms, checking sheep for injured hooves or signs of sickness. The work never truly ends. Mountain survival depends on constant maintenance. A loose roof tile ignored today becomes freezing disaster during the next storm, and storms always return, yet despite the endless labour. Your thoughts begin drifting strangely now that immediate danger has eased. You forget which day of the week it might be, then realise medieval shepherds probably cared very little about such things while isolated. In winter mountains, time here follows weather instead. Sunrise, snowfall, feeding hours, firewood supplies, the movement of clouds across ridges. The old shepherd barely speaks unless necessary. Still, his presence becomes oddly reassuring. Each evening he sharpens tools beside the fire or repairs harness straps with slow, careful hands, while smoke curls lazily through the rafters. You start copying his habits without realizing it, checking the sky before sleep, drying boots beside the fire in exactly the same place, counting sheep automatically whenever the flock shifts. Mountain routine settles into the body like another layer of clothing. One old tale from the Alps claimed shepherds who spent too many winters alone above the valleys gradually forgot how to speak comfortably with ordinary townspeople. Whether literal or exaggerated, the story probably reflected a real truth about isolation. The mountains simplify human interaction. Animals need feeding. Fires need tending. Weather needs watching. Everything else begins fading quietly into the background. One afternoon, while gathering wood along the edge of the forest, you suddenly stop walking. Not because of danger, because the silence feels enormous. Nose hangs heavily across the pine branches. Cold sunlight filters through drifting mist. Somewhere far off, a raven calls once before the sound disappears into the mountains. And for several long moments, you genuinely cannot remember the last thing you were thinking about. Your mind has become quieter here. Researchers studying long-term isolation often note how repetitive environments alter human perception of time and memory. Medieval shepherds probably experienced similar psychological effects during extended seasons alone with weather, animals, and silence. Though unlike modern research subjects, they also had wolves occasionally watching them from forests, which certainly keeps the mind alert. That evening, the valley gathers around one larger fire near the centre shelter. Not celebration exactly, simply practicality. Shared warmth burns less wood than separate fires in every hut. You sit among perhaps a dozen shepherds while sparks rise into the cold night air overhead. Faces glow orange in the firelight. Heavy cloaks steam gently as snow melts from boots and sleeves. Someone passes round rough wine in a leather flask. It tastes terrible. You drink anyway. Stories move slowly around the fire after dark, news from lower valleys, dangerous passes blocked by storms, rumours of raids far beyond the mountains, arguments about which villages cheat wool traders most aggressively. Some complaints clearly survive every century unchanged. One younger shepherd swears he heard singing near the upper ridge during the recent blizzard. Not human singing exactly. Something stranger drifting through the snow after midnight. Several others laugh immediately, but not everyone laughs. Mountain folklore across medieval Europe frequently blurred together natural dangers and supernatural explanations. Avalanches became angry spirits, sudden storms became curses, lonely deaths in snowfields inspired tales of wandering ghosts calling travellers away from safe roads. You listen quietly while wind brushes across the valley walls outside the firelight. No one entirely agrees whether people truly believed such stories or simply enjoyed repeating them during long winters. The line between cautionary tale and sincere belief often remained blurry in isolated communities, especially communities surrounded by enormous dark mountains. Later that night, you walk back toward your shelter beneath clear skies for the first time in days. The stars astonish you. Without towns or villages nearby, the sky stretches impossibly bright above the valley. Thousands upon thousands of cold white stars burn across the darkness while snow glows faintly blue beneath their light. The air feels painfully clean. You stop beside the sheep enclosure listening to their slow breathing in the cold. The bell sheep shifts once in her sleep. Clunk! Soft and familiar! And suddenly you realize something unsettling. The mountains no longer feel entirely foreign. You understand their rhythms better now. The silence, the weather, the routines. Even the loneliness has become strangely comfortable at times. That realization frightens you slightly, because part of you has begun wondering how long a person could live like this before the valley below stopped feeling like home at all. The stories begin after the fire burns low. That seems important somehow. Nobody starts telling mountain tales while daylight remains or while practical tasks still need doing. First the sheep must settle, water must melt, tools must be repaired, dogs must eat, only then. When darkness fully surrounds the valley and sparks drift upward into blackness, do the old stories emerge beside the flames. You sit wrapped in wool near the edge of the firelight, listening quietly while snow falls beyond the shelters. The younger shepherd from earlier speaks first. He swears again that he heard singing during the blizzard. Not close. Far upslope near the buried pass. Thin voices drifting through the snow after midnight. Another man snorts into his cup and blames wind-crossing ice. But the younger shepherd shakes his head stubbornly. Too human, he insists. Insists. Too sad. The fire crackles softly between them. Nobody laughs very hard this time. Life in isolated medieval mountain regions produced endless folklore about hidden beings, wandering spirits, and dangerous places after dark. Long winters, sudden deaths, avalanches, and disappearances all encouraged storytelling that blurred together fear, memory, and landscape. And honestly, after enough nights listening to wolves beneath frozen cliffs, even you begin understanding how imagination stretches in lonely places. The old shepherd pokes the fire thoughtfully before speaking at last. He tells of a ridge farther north where travellers supposedly vanished during storms no matter how carefully they followed the trail. Some believed the mountain itself confused people there. Others blamed restless spirits buried beneath old avalanche snow. A few listeners quietly crossed themselves. You glance toward the doorway where darkness presses against the valley beyond the firelight. The mountains feel very large tonight. One especially peculiar tradition from parts of the Balkans involved hanging carved wooden charms near sheep enclosures to discourage supernatural creatures believed to steal livestock during winter nights. Some charms resembled twisted faces. Others looked more like abstract knots or crosses. Whether they frightened demons remains uncertain. They probably frightened visiting children quite effectively, though. Outside, the dogs suddenly lift their heads together. Every conversation stops immediately. Silence fills the shelter. The dogs stare toward the darkness beyond the entrance. One growls softly deep in its chest while snow hisses against the valley walls outside. You feel tension spread through the room without anyone speaking. Then the dogs relax again. False alarm, probably. Someone exhales loudly. Conversation resumes quieter now. A shepherd across the fire describes finding strange tracks one winter, near an abandoned grazing shelter high above the eastern ridge. Not wolf tracks, not bear, long narrow footprints appearing beside his flock each morning before vanishing into deep snow. Another man claims they were smugglers. A third says mountain spirits. The old shepherd says nothing at all. Many medieval people interpreted unfamiliar natural events through folklore because scientific explanations simply didn't exist in the modern sense. Strange tracks, unusual weather, or sudden illness often became attached to local legends that evolved over generations. The mountains encouraged mystery naturally. Fog hid distances, storms erased evidence, and lonely humans filled silence with stories. You notice something interesting as the night deepens. Nobody tells heroic tales. No glorious battles or shining kings appear in these conversations. Mountain folklore feels smaller, stranger, more cautious somehow. Stories about getting lost, about hearing voices during storms, about animals behaving oddly before avalanches. Practical fear wrapped in supernatural clothing. The fire burns lower still. Smoke drifts lazily through the rafters while snow continues falling outside in soft, endless layers. One shepherd begins carving absent-minded patterns into a scrap of wood while listening to the others speak. The sound reminds you of insects quietly moving through summer grass far below the mountains. That world feels impossibly distant now. A surviving collection of alpine folk tales mentions phantom bells supposedly heard during severe snowstorms. According to the stories, travellers who followed the mysterious ringing often wandered away from safe paths and vanished into ravines or deep drifts, which honestly sounds very similar to ordinary hypothermia mixed with terrifying weather. Still, the image lingers in your mind. You think about it later while stepping outside briefly before sleep. The valley lies silent beneath fresh snow. Stars flicker faintly between moving clouds overhead. Every shelter glows softly from within, orange firelight shining through narrow shutters and smoke holes. The sheep sleep gathered together in pale, woolly masses. One dog watches you from beside the enclosure, alert even now. You walk a short distance from the shelters and stop near the edge of the valley. Beyond the firelight, the mountains rise black and enormous against the night sky. Then you hear it. A bell. Faint. Very far away. Clunk. Pause. Clunk. Not from your flock. Not from any nearby enclosure either. The sound drifts down from somewhere high above the valley, where no trails should remain open after the storm. You stand motionless, listening. Again. Clunk. The sound fades into wind afterward. Probably another shepherd crossing distant slopes late at night. Nothing supernatural, nothing mysterious. Yet you find yourself returning to the shelter more quickly than intended. Inside, warmth and smoke wrap around you again. Most of the others already sleep beneath blankets and sheepskins, while embers glow softly in the hearth. The old shepherd remains awake, though. He glances up briefly as you settle near the fire. Then, quietly, without expression, he asks whether you heard the bell too. You stare at him for a moment. Outside, wind brushes gently across the valley. No further bells sound through the darkness, and despite everything rational inside your mind, sleep comes more slowly that night while the mountains wait silently beyond the walls. You notice the missing sheep at dawn. At first, the absence feels almost invisible. The flock shifts slowly within the enclosure, while pale morning light spreads across the valley, snow. Steam rises from woolly backs. Bells clink softly through the cold air. Everything appears ordinary. Then your counting falters. You count again and again. 3 missing. Your stomach tightens immediately. The old shepherd sees your expression before you even speak. Together you move through the enclosure carefully, checking corners, broken fencing, and narrow gaps beneath snow-covered stone walls. Nothing, only tracks leading outward into the trees beyond the valley. Fresh tracks. The dogs already know. Both animals pace near the trail with raised fur and lowered heads, sniffing the frozen air while growls rumble softly in their throats. One begins pulling forward immediately toward the forest. Wolves, perhaps, or panic during the night. A frightened sheep can wander astonishing distances through snow before realizing every decision in its life has led to catastrophe. Losing animals during winter's migrations happened often enough that medieval law codes sometimes included detailed compensation rules for missing livestock, disputed ownership, and grazing accidents. Shepherding demanded constant counting precisely because sheep disappeared with frustrating reliability. Some vanished through storms, some through predators, some simply wandered directly into the trouble with remarkable commitment. You pull your cloak tighter and follow the tracks into the forest beside the old shepherd and the dogs. Snow crunches sharply beneath your boots. The air smells painfully cold this morning. Pine branches droop overhead beneath thick frost while sunlight filters weakly through drifting mist between the trees. The tracks remain clear at first. 3 sheep, running. You can tell from the deep, uneven marks scattered across the snow. The dogs move ahead silently now, no longer barking. Their bodies stiffen whenever they pause to sniff the wind. You grip your walking staff harder without realizing it. The forest absorbs sound strangely in winter. Every distant crack echoes sharply. Then silence returns twice as deep afterward. An old belief from mountain communities in northern Spain warned shepherds never to follow lost livestock too quickly after sunrise because evil spirits supposedly disguised themselves as wandering sheep to lure travelers into ravines. Realistically, exhaustion and poor visibility probably cause more disappearances than supernatural trickery. Still, the story feels less ridiculous while staring into endless snowy woods. The tracks descend gradually toward a narrow ravine where frozen water glimmers faintly beneath buried ice. Snowdrifts crowd between exposed rocks and twisted tree roots. Then you find blood. Not much, just small scattered drops across the snow. The dogs stop instantly. So do you. Fresh. Your heartbeat grows louder. The old shepherd crouches silently, studying the ground while wind brushes through the pines overhead. One dog suddenly moves farther ahead into the ravine, nose low against the snow. You follow carefully. The ravine narrows sharply between blackstone walls coated in ice. Snow has drifted deeply here. Cold shadows linger untouched by sunlight. Then you see the first sheep, alive. Barely. The animal lies trapped between rocks with one injured leg twisted beneath its body. Frost clings across its wool while frightened eyes roll wildly at your approach. Relief floods through you unexpectedly. One found. Two still missing. You and the old shepherd work carefully freeing the sheep from the rocks while the dogs continue searching farther ahead. The injured leg appears broken. Bad news in these mountains. A hard truth of medieval pastoral life is that injured livestock often represented impossible choices. Shepherds lacked modern veterinary medicine, and survival sometimes demanded harsh practical decisions when food, time, or weather ran short. The old shepherd studies the leg quietly, then shakes his head once. You understand immediately. The sheep will not survive the journey. Neither of you speaks about it. Instead, you continue tracking the others deeper through the ravine, while the injured animal remains behind beneath a pine tree, wrapped loosely in spare cloth against the cold. The second sheep appears farther downslope, dead. No dramatic gore, only stillness, snow dusting its wool, tracks everywhere around it. Wolf tracks. The dogs grow tense immediately, circling outward through the trees while staring into the forest shadows. One low growl vibrates through the frozen air. The wolves may still be close. Your breath fogs heavily now, despite the cold. Adrenaline warms your body in strange, sharp waves. Every dark gap between the trees suddenly looks occupied. Some surviving chronicles from rural Europe describe shepherds carrying small horns or whistles specifically to rally nearby herders during predator attacks or emergencies. Mountain isolation made cooperation valuable whenever danger appeared suddenly. Unfortunately, no nearby help exists today. Only you, the old shepherd, the dogs, and somewhere beyond the trees, wolves watching quietly. You continue searching for the third sheep The trail climbs awkwardly through dense forest where snow hangs heavy across the branches. The dogs move faster now, pulling ahead repeatedly before returning to circle around you again. Then one dog barks sharply uphill. You hurry forward. The final sheep stands trapped beneath fallen branches near the edge of a steep slope, alive, shaking violently, too terrified to move. You nearly laugh from relief. The old shepherd cuts the branches free while you calm the animal enough to guide it carefully back towards safer ground. The dogs remain alert the entire time, staring constantly into the woods around you. Yet no wolves appear, only tracks. Always tracks. By the time you return to the valley, daylight already fades behind the ridges. The surviving sheep limps badly beside you while the flock crowds anxiously near the enclosure walls. The missing animals have changed the mood of the valley completely. Conversations grow quieter that evening beside the fire. People count their flocks more carefully. The dogs remain restless long after dark. You sit beside the flames, staring into the smoke while snow begins falling lightly once more outside. 3 sheep missing, 1 dead, 1 doomed, 1 barely saved. The mountains take things slowly sometimes. Not always through storms or avalanches. Sometimes one animal at a time beneath silent trees where wolves leave careful footprints in the snow. Several days later, the valley begins preparing for descent. Winter still rules the mountains. Snow remains deep across the higher ridges, and storms continue drifting through the passes without warning. But supplies run low. Salt dwindles. Lamp oil nearly disappears. Wool must eventually be traded before spring roads turn entirely to mud. So some of the shepherds prepare for the market below. You among them. The journey downward begins before sunrise beneath a pale grey sky. Smaller flocks remain behind in the hidden valley, while selected animals travel with the trading group toward the lower settlements. Bells echo softly through the cold morning air as sheep move between the trees in long, uneven lines. The dogs seem almost cheerful today, or perhaps simply relieved to walk somewhere that does not involve wolves, avalanches, or snow deep enough to swallow furniture. You descend slowly along ancient trails packed hard by generations of hooves and boots. The air changes as elevation drops. Pine forests thicken. Frozen streams move more freely beneath thinning ice. By midday you even smell damp earth beneath the snow for the first time in weeks. The scent feels almost shocking, like remembering another world still exists somewhere below the mountains. Seasonal wool trading formed an essential part of many medieval rural economies. Mountain shepherds rarely lived entirely isolated from market systems. Even remote herding communities depended on exchanging wool, cheese, hides, and livestock for tools, grain, salt, and other necessities unavailable in the highlands. Survival required commerce as much as endurance. The road widens gradually as you descend farther. Soon you begin passing signs of ordinary life again. Woodcutters hauling sleds stacked with timber. Farmers repairing fences beside half-buried fields. Smoke rising from scattered cottages tucked against the hillsides. Every encounter feels strangely loud after so much mountain silence. People ask questions constantly. How deep is the snow above the ridge? Have wolves been active this season? Is the northern pass still blocked? Did anyone survive the Great Storm last month? News travels slowly in the medieval world, especially through winter mountains. Shepherds often carried information between isolated communities almost as reliably as official messengers, which means you are now both exhausted livestock manager and accidental travelling newspaper. By late afternoon, the market town finally appears beside a winding river below the foothills. The sight overwhelms you slightly. Noise, movement, colour. After weeks of snowfields and dark pines, the crowded streets almost feel unreal. Wagons rattle across frozen mud. Vendors shout beneath striped awnings. Smoke and cooking smells drift through the cold air from bakeries, taverns, and crowded kitchens. You stop walking for a moment simply to absorb it all. The sheep do not share your emotional reflection. They immediately begin causing problems. One attempts eating vegetables directly from a market cart. Another becomes trapped beneath a wagon tongue. The bell sheep somehow wanders toward a blacksmith shop and nearly causes panic among two horses already having a difficult morning. Some things remain constant regardless of location. The market itself spreads across a muddy square lined with timber buildings, blackened by smoke and winter weather. Wool traders inspect animals carefully while scribes record weights and payments onto wax tablets or scraps of parchment. Money changes hands constantly here. So do arguments. Records from medieval trade centres show that wool remained one of Europe's most valuable commercial goods for centuries. Entire towns prospered through textile production, and high-quality wool from mountain flocks could command respectable prices depending on region and season, which suddenly explains why everyone keeps grabbing sheep and squinting at them professionally. You help unload bundles of wool inside a crowded storage hall that smells strongly of lanolin, wet leather, and damp straw. Merchants move through the chaos carrying scales, tally sticks, an expression suggesting they trust absolutely nobody. Probably wise. One merchant examines your wool while muttering about storm damage and coarse texture in a tone implying you personally created winter out of spite. You resist the urge to throw him into the nearest snowbank. A curious custom in several medieval trading regions involved sealing major wool agreements with shared drinks rather than written contracts alone. Ale, wine, or spiced liquor often accompanied negotiations as both celebration and informal proof of trust between buyers and sellers. Human beings apparently discovered business lunches very early. Evening settles slowly over the town while lanterns glow along the muddy streets. After weeks in isolated shelters, the tavern feels impossibly warm and crowded. Voices overlap everywhere. Someone plays a stringed instrument badly in the corner while merchants argue beside the fire over taxes and transport costs. You sit near the wall, drinking watered ale and trying not to stare at everything. The smells alone overwhelm you. Roasted meat, beer, smoke, wet wool drying beside the hearth, human bodies packed close together after long winter travel. The old shepherd seems completely unbothered by the noise. He simply eats stew in silence while the dogs sleep beneath the table surrounded by dropped scraps from grateful strangers. The animals have earned celebrity status after surviving the mountain storms. A few local children approach cautiously just to stare at them. One boy asks whether the dogs truly fought wolves. The old shepherd answers only by pointing toward the scars across one animal's muzzle. The child immediately looks both horrified and impressed. Some historians suggest medieval market gatherings also served an important social function for isolated rural workers who otherwise spent long seasons separated from wider communities. Shepherds likely exchanged stories, weather knowledge, gossip, and marriage news alongside ordinary trade. You understand that now. Already the town feels noisy and exhausting, yet part of you enjoys hearing unfamiliar voices again after endless wind and sheep bells. Later that night you step briefly outside the tavern. Snow falls lightly across the rooftops while river water moves dark beneath thin ice nearby. Far above the town, the mountains rise black against the cloudy sky. You can barely see them from here, yet you feel their presence constantly. The strange quiet, the cold routine. Teens. The endless white ridges. Already the crowded market feels temporary compared with the ancient patience of those frozen slopes waiting beyond the valley. And tomorrow, once trade finishes and supplies are loaded, you will climb upward again, back toward the mountains, back toward the sheep, back toward the silence that no longer feels entirely strange. You realize something is wrong halfway back up the mountain. At first it feels small, a slight ache behind the eyes, heavy limbs, the strange sensation that your boots weigh twice as much as yesterday. You blame the climb naturally. The trail rising from the market town twists steeply through muddy foothills where melting snow turns every step into slippery misery. Then the shivering begins. Not ordinary cold, something deeper. You pull your cloak tighter while the flock moves slowly ahead between the trees. The old shepherd glances toward you once but says nothing. Perhaps he already recognizes the signs. Mountain sickness rarely announces itself dramatically at first. Medieval shepherds faced constant exposure to infection, exhaustion, smoke inhalation, poor nutrition, and untreated injuries during long winters in isolated conditions. Even minor illnesses could become dangerous far from villages or trained healers. And unfortunately, medieval medicine was not exactly operating at peak pharmaceutical performance. By evening you can barely hold the bowl of stew without trembling. The shelter feels too warm and too cold simultaneously. Firelight blurs strangely across the stone walls. Every muscle aches beneath your skin while smoke from the hearth twists upward in slow, nauseating waves. The dogs watch you quietly from beside the entrance. The old shepherd presses a rough hand against your forehead, then mutters something under his breath and begins boiling herbs in water near the fire. Wonderful. Nothing inspires confidence quite like mysterious mountain tea prepared by a man who looks old enough to remember the invention of winter itself. Outside, snow falls steadily across the valley again. Inside, fever wraps around you slowly. Sleep comes in broken pieces that night. Strange dreams drift through your mind. Endless sheep bells echoing through fog. Wolves walking slingwards beside the flock. Frozen ridges stretching forever beneath pale skies where no villages exist anymore. You wake repeatedly wet and despite the cold. The old shepherd forces bitter herbal broth into your hands each time. Some medieval remedies for sickness relied on plants genuinely useful against pain or infection. Others wandered more confidently into superstition. Herbal mixtures, charms, prayers, bloodletting, and smoke treatments all appeared in surviving medical texts depending on region and tradition. Modern medicine would likely have several concerned opinions about many of them. Morning arrives grey and miserable. You attempt standing. Your legs immediately reconsider the idea. The old shepherd pushes you gently back toward the blankets without argument. Outside, the flock begins moving with the other herders, while you remain beside the fire, listening to bells fade gradually into the snowy distance. Clunk, clink, softer, then silence. The feeling unsettles you more than expected. For weeks, your entire existence revolved around movement and routine. Counting sheep, climbing trails, watching weather. Suddenly remaining still feels wrong somehow, as if the mountains continue moving without your permission. The shelter smells strongly of smoke and herbs now. Steam rises constantly from the simmering pot near the fire while wind brushes softly against the outer walls. You drift in and out of sleep. At one point you wake convinced someone stands near the doorway watching you. A tall figure wrapped in snow-covered wool with frost covering its face. But the shelter remains empty except for one sleeping dog. Fever plays tricks in lonely places. Several surviving medieval texts mention shepherds and rural workers relying heavily on folk healers or practical household remedies because professional physicians remained concentrated mainly in larger towns and noble households. Mountain communities often developed their own traditions for treating cold injuries, lung sickness, and exhaustion. Whether those treatments truly helped remains difficult to judge centuries later. Still, people survived often enough to keep using them. By the second evening, your cough worsens, dry at first, then deeper. Each breath burns faintly in your chest. The old shepherd adds pine resin and unfamiliar herbs to the fire, filling the shelter with sharp medicinal smoke that stings your eyes but clears your breathing slightly. You smell like an enchanted forest now, a very sick enchanted forest. Outside, weather shifts again. Warmer wind moves through the valley, carrying dampness instead of sharp ice. Snow begins sliding from rooftops in heavy wet crashes. The change sounds strangely loud after so many frozen weeks. Drip, crack, sliding snow, running water somewhere beneath the ice. One unusual remedy recorded in Alpine folk medicine involved placing heated stones wrapped in cloth near the feet and chest of sick shepherds to restore warmth and strength during winter illnesses. Another practice recommended sleeping beside healthy sheep for added body heat. Human civilization has explored some truly creative healthcare solutions. The fever finally breaks late that night. Not dramatically. You simply wake and realize the crushing heaviness has eased slightly. Your clothes cling damp against your skin from sweat. The fire burns low beside the wall. Outside, rain taps softly against melting snow for the first time in many days. Rain. The sound almost startles you. Winter weakening. The old shepherd notices immediately when you sit upright without shaking. He nods once, then hands you bread. Recovery in the medieval world often depended less on miracle cures than on rest. Warmth, food, and simple luck. Many people survived illnesses that seemed terrifying. Many others died from infections modern medicine would barely notice. The line between recovery and disaster remained painfully thin. Over the next 2 days, your strength returned slowly. You help with smaller tasks first, carrying water, repairing harness straps, feeding the dogs. Even ordinary movement feels exhausting at first, yet the valley itself has changed while you lay sick beside the fire. Snow softens along the lower slopes now. Icicles drip steadily from roof edges during daylight hours. Patches of dark earth emerge beside your Saxon tree root. Tiny signs, but unmistakable ones. Winter is loosening, and as you step outside the shelter breathing cold damp air beneath the mountains once more, you realize the season that nearly swallowed you whole may finally be beginning to retreat. The avalanche begins with a sound too large for the mountains. At first you mistake it for thunder. A deep rolling crack echoes across the upper ridge, while the flock grazes quietly along the lower slopes beneath clear morning skies. Snowmelt drips steadily from rocks nearby. The air smells wet for the first time in weeks. Then the ground trembles faintly beneath your boots. Every dog in the valley reacts instantly. Heads rise. Bodies stiffen. One begins barking furiously uphill. You turn toward the ridge just as another crack splits through the air. Sharper this time, high above the valley. A huge sheet of snow suddenly fractures loose from the mountainside and starts moving. The entire slope collapses downward in slow, horrifying silence for one impossible moment. Then the roar arrives. Snow explodes across the mountainside in a white wall of ice, broken trees, and shattered crust racing downhill faster than thought itself. The sound becomes enormous, like rivers and storms and collapsing stone all crashing together at once. The sheep panic immediately. The flock surges in every direction while bells clang wildly through the chaos. Dogs bark, shepherds shout, snow sprays upward across the valley floor as people scramble to drive animals away from the lower slope. You run without fully deciding to. Every instinct inside your body screams, move. Avalanches represented one of the deadliest hazards in medieval mountain life, especially during late winter and early spring when warming temperatures destabilized deep snowpacks. Entire paths, shelters, and grazing areas could vanish within seconds beneath moving snow and debris. The mountains never needed wolves to kill people. The avalanche tears through the upper pine forest first. Trees snap like dry twigs beneath the white surge. Snow and ice pour through the ravine above the valley in a towering, rolling mass that swallows everything in its path. The sound drowns out human voices completely. You force terrified sheep towards safer ground beside exposed rocks while the dogs race frantically around the edges of the flock. One lamb bolts directly uphill in panic. A dog slams into it sideways before the animal reaches the open slope. Professional as always. The avalanche finally slows before reaching the valley center, but the damage still feels enormous. Snow piles across the lower trail in massive tangled heaps mixed with broken branches and shattered timber dragged down from above. Then silence falls, heavy, unnatural. The entire valley stands motionless, staring at the destroyed slope while loose snow continues drifting lazily through the air afterward. Nobody speaks immediately. Your heartbeat pounds so hard you hear it inside your ears. The old shepherd appears beside you breathing heavily. Snow dust coats his beard and cloak. One of the dogs limps slightly but remains alert, pacing near the flock while scanning the mountainside above. The sheep continue trembling long after the noise stops. People living in mountain regions often developed seasonal rituals tied specifically to avalanche fears. In some communities, church bells rang before dangerous crossings. Elsewhere, travellers pause for prayers before entering unstable passes known for deadly slides. After witnessing this, you strongly support any tradition involving caution. The next hours pass intense labour. Everyone begins checking for missing animals, damaged shelters, or trapped people near the lower trail. Fortunately, the avalanche stops short of the valley itself. Luck. Pure luck. Even so, several sheep vanished beneath the snow along the edge of the slope. You help dig carefully through packed drifts where the dogs sniff and bark near buried scent trails. The avalanche debris feels shockingly dense already, more like frozen cement than ordinary snow. One sheep emerges alive after nearly an hour. Another does not. The mountain chooses randomly sometimes. A surviving account from alpine regions described avalanches as white dragons descending from the peaks. The image sounds dramatic until you actually watch an entire mountainside begin moving toward you with unstoppable force. Then suddenly the metaphor feels restrained. By afternoon, the valley settles into exhausted quiet again. Broken branches litter the snow. The lower trail has vanished completely beneath huge mounds of debris stretching across the ravine. That route will remain unusable for weeks now, perhaps longer. You sit beside a rock outcrop drinking melted snow while staring at the scar cut across the mountainside. Bare earth and shattered trees now slice through the white slopes above like an open wound. The avalanche changed the landscape in minutes. Mountain people understood this reality intimately. Trails shifted, forests vanished. Rivers changed direction after storms or landslides. Wilderness remained unstable in ways valley farmers rarely experienced directly. The old shepherd loafers himself beside you with a tired grunt. For several minutes, neither of you speaks. The dogs finally relax enough to sleep nearby. One twitches occasionally while dreaming, probably chasing wolves or judging Toward evening, clouds gather again over the higher peaks. Soft grey shadows spread across the valley, while shepherds repair fencing damage during the panic. Bells sound more calmly now as the flock settles together once more. Routine returns surprisingly quickly after danger. Perhaps it must. Human beings cannot remain terrified constantly and still survive mountain life. Eventually, even avalanches become another task to work around. Another ruined trail, another story added beside the fire after dark. Still, as night falls and you walk near the buried ravine, you notice something unsettling. The avalanche path remains utterly silent. No birds, no wind through branches, nothing. Just enormous frozen drifts glowing pale beneath the evening sky where the mountain briefly revealed its strength without effort. You stand there a long moment listening to the silence, then turn back towards the valley fires before darkness fully arrives. Because some parts of the mountains deserve respect from a distance. The stories of the lost shepherds always begin quietly. No heroic final battles. No dramatic speeches shouted into the blizzards. Usually someone simply fails to return. A man leaves with sheep before dawn, or crosses a ridge during bad weather, or follows a missing animal into fog. Then the mountain closes behind him, and weeks later another shepherd discovers a staff protruding from snow beside frozen bones and scraps of wool cloth. The valley speaks softly tonight while the fire burns low. After the avalanche, everyone seems more thoughtful somehow. The mountains have reminded the shepherds exactly who holds power here. Conversation drifts naturally toward older tragedies buried beneath local memory. The old shepherd speaks less than usual. Another man tells most of the stories. You sit listening while rain taps gently against the shelter roof outside. The weather has softened over the last week. Snow melts steadily during daylight hours now, exposing dark rocks and muddy patches along the lower slopes. But higher ridges remain dangerous. Always dangerous. The man beside the fire describes a shepherd discovered years earlier, beneath melting spring snow far north of the valley. His flock survived the winter scattered across several slopes while he remained trapped beneath an avalanche drift. No one noticed until thaw season. Only the bell beside his body still worked. The room falls silent for a moment after that. Death in mountain regions often left very little behind. Archaeologists working in alpine areas have uncovered preserved clothing, tools, and animal remains from travellers lost in snow centuries ago. Cold conditions sometimes protected objects with eerie completeness. The mountains keep their dead carefully. One of the younger shepherds pokes nervously at the fire and asks whether anyone remembers the old northern crossing near Black Ridge. Several older men glance at one another immediately. Apparently, yes. The route once connected two valleys before repeated avalanches and disappearances made people abandon it almost entirely. Some still use sections during summer. Almost nobody crosses there in winter anymore. Too many vanished. The old shepherd finally speaks then. He says weather alone explains most disappearances. Fog, snow blindness, hidden crevasses, exhaustion, simple mistakes becoming fatal far from help. Yet even he admits some bodies were never found despite extensive searches. That detail lingers uncomfortably in the shelter afterward. A strange medieval custom from parts of the Alps involved placing small stone cairns beside dangerous passes whenever travellers died nearby. Future travellers added more stones while crossing safely, creating rough memorials that slowly grew over generations. Part warning, part prayer, part conversation with the dead. You imagine hundreds of frozen hands building those little towers through centuries of storms and silence. Outside, the dogs begin barking suddenly near the sheep enclosure. Not frantic, alert. Everyone pauses instinctively. Then one shepherd laughs quietly and mutters that the dogs probably smell foxes near the lower stream. Still, several men stand to check anyway. Mountain life trains caution deeply into the body. You step outside with them into the damp, cold night. Mist drifts between the shelters, while melting snow drips steadily from roof edges. The sheep remain calm enough, clustered together beneath weak moonlight. The dogs pace near the edge of the valley, staring up slope toward the dark forest. Nothing moves there, at least nothing visible. One thing becomes clear living among these shepherds. The mountains sharpen superstition without fully replacing reason. People recognize natural danger perfectly well. Avalanches bury trails, wolves hunt livestock, cold kills travelers. Yet folklore still slips quietly into the empty spaces where certainty ends. Why did one man survive the storm while another vanished only yards away? Why do some paths seem cursed generation after generation? Why do certain valleys feel wrong after dark, even during calm weather? No one agrees entirely. You return to the fire afterward, where the stories continue more softly now. Someone mentions hearing bells during fog with no visible flock nearby. Another remembers an old woman claiming the mountains collected lonely souls the way valleys collected rainwater. The younger shepherd from earlier, Asa, asks whether anyone truly believes spirits wander the passes. The old shepherd shrugs slowly, then says the mountains do not need spirits to kill people, which somehow feels more unsettling. Several medieval religious writers described high wilderness areas as places of spiritual testing, where isolation stripped away ordinary distractions and forced humans to confront fear, temptation, and mortality directly. Mountains appeared repeatedly in stories about visions, hermits, miracles, and demons. You understand the symbolism now. Everything feels sharper here. Silence, cold, loneliness, even memory itself. Later that night you cannot sleep. Rain continues falling gently outside while the fire collapses slowly into glowing embers. Around you, the other shepherds breathe heavily beneath blankets and cloaks. You step quietly outside. The valley lies wrapped in mist beneath faint moonlight. Water trickles everywhere now beneath thinning snow. Dark earth spreads wider each day along the lower slopes. Spring approaches slowly, yet the mountains still loom huge and black beyond the valley. Their upper ridges buried deep beneath winter. You walk toward the edge of the avalanche scar again almost without thinking. The snow there has begun settling into dirty, uneven ridges mixed with broken trees and exposed stone. Meltwater runs through narrow channels beneath the debris with soft, whispering sounds. Then you notice something half buried nearby. Wood. You kneel carefully and brush away wet snow. A shepherd's staff. Old, weather-cracked. Far older than anyone currently living in the valley. You stare at it quietly while cold mist drifts across the ruined slope. Perhaps the staff washed free from older avalanche debris. Perhaps it belonged to some forgotten traveller buried here years ago. Or centuries. The mountains rarely explain themselves. You leave the staff where it rests. Some objects feel better undisturbed. As you walk back toward the valley lights, sheep bells ring softly through the darkness behind you. Familiar now, comforting almost, and somewhere high above the melting slopes and black forests, hidden beyond fog and snowfields, countless untold stories still sleep beneath the ice waiting for spring to uncover them. Spring arrives so slowly you almost miss it. No grand transformation sweeps across the mountains overnight. No magical thaw suddenly turns the frozen valleys green. Instead, the season changes through tiny, quiet details repeated day after day until one morning you realize winter has loosened its grip at last. Water runs everywhere now, beneath the snow, along the rocks, through muddy channels cutting across old trails. The valley sounds different because of it. Constant dripping echoes from the shelter roofs. Streams murmur beneath thinning ice. Snow slides from branches in soft, wet collapses whenever sunlight touches the trees. Even the air smells different. Damp earth, pine needles, cold flowing water instead of endless frost. The sheep notice before you fully do. They spread wider while grazing now, searching eagerly through exposed patches of grass appearing along the lower slopes. Lambs born during the late winter storms stumble awkwardly through the mud beside their mothers. The dogs seem calmer too. No wolves have approached the valley closely in days. Winter starvation weakens predators as well as people. Seasonal thaw created dangerous conditions of its own in medieval mountain regions. Melting snow destabilized trails. flooded crossings and triggered landslides long after the worst storms ended. Shepherds moving flocks during spring had to navigate rapidly changing terrain almost every day. The mountains simply exchanged one set of problems for another. This morning you helped repair a bridge made from rough pine logs crossing the stream below the valley. Meltwater crashes beneath the structure louder than expected, brown and swollen from weeks of thaw higher up the slopes. Your boots sink into mud constantly now. After months of frozen ground, the softness feels strange beneath your feet. The old shepherd claims spring mud kills more patience than winter snow. You are beginning to understand his argument. One sheep becomes trapped halfway through the stream crossing, almost immediately after repairs finish. The animal stares at rushing water with the expression of someone deeply betrayed by geography itself. You pull it free while soaking one leg entirely. Mountain dignity remains difficult to maintain. Accounts from medieval farming communities often describe spring as both hopeful and exhausting. Winter survival no longer dominated daily life, but new labour exploded everywhere at once. Repairs, planting, trading, births, and migrations all demanded attention simultaneously. Human beings rarely receive calm transitions between disasters. As afternoon sunlight spreads across the valley, you climb toward a higher ridge with part of the flock searching for fresh grazing ground uncovered by melting snow. The landscape changes visibly with elevation. Below, streams flow freely between dark rocks and exposed grass. Higher up, winter still rules completely. Snowdrifts remain deep beneath the shadowed cliffs. Ice hangs from overhanging ledges in long blue-white spears. Fog drifts slowly through the upper forests where cold air lingers stubbornly between the trees. The mountain resists surrender. One unusual belief from the Carpathian region warned shepherds not to celebrate spring too early, because winter spirits supposedly became jealous if mocked before the final snow melted from the high ridges. After surviving these mountains yourself, caution seems reasonable. You pause near a rocky outcrop while the sheep graze nearby. Sunlight warms the stone beneath your gloves, far below. The valley shelters appear tiny now beside winding meltwater streams and dark pine forests. The silence feels softer these days, not empty, simply less harsh. Birdsong returns gradually to the slopes. Ravens still circle overhead. But smaller birds move through the trees again carrying bits of moss and dry grass for their nests. Once, you even spot deer tracks crossing muddy snow near the eastern ridge. Leiferen. Returning carefully. Researchers examining medieval seasonal migration patterns believe many shepherd communities timed movements not only around weather, but around the behaviour of plants and animals appearing after winter. Ecological knowledge mattered enormously long before scientific terminology existed for it. People survived by observing details closely. The flock drifts farther upslope while clouds gather lazily overhead. Not storm clouds exactly, spring clouds, taller, softer, filled with shifting silver light rather than endless winter grey. You realise suddenly that you no longer feel cold all the time. That constant deep ache inside your fingers and shoulders has faded gradually without you noticing. Even the wind carries less cruelty now when it moves across the ridges, though your boots still smell absolutely medieval. Some things cannot be fixed by changing seasons. By evening the valley glows gold beneath low sunlight. Smoke rises gently from the shelters while shepherds gather near the stream washing winter grime from tools, clothing, and themselves. The old shepherd even laughs once while watching a younger man slip knee-deep into mud beside the enclosure. A rare historical event, apparently. You sit nearby repairing a cracked leather strap while listening to water rush over stones beside the valley floor. Sheep bells drift softly through the evening air, mixed with distant bird calls and barking dogs. The sounds of survival have changed. Winter sounded like wind. Spring sounds like water. A weathered traveller arrives shortly before dark, leading 2 exhausted pack mules through the lower trail. Everyone watches immediately while the dogs inspect him carefully near the valley entrance. News travels with him. Lower passes reopening, market roads clearing, villages preparing spring fairs below the mountains. The world beyond the snow has begun moving again. You feel something complicated hearing that. Relief, perhaps, but also reluctance. Because despite the storms, wolves, hunger, and endless cold, these mountains have become familiar to you now. Their rhythms live inside your body. Wake before dawn, count sheep, watch clouds, follow bells through fog and snow. Simple things, ancient things. That night, after darkness settles softly across the thawing valley, you step outside alone one final time before sleep. Water glimmers beneath moonlight everywhere now. Tiny streams move through the snowfields carrying winter slowly away toward distant rivers and valleys far below. The mountains remain huge above you, but no longer entirely frozen, and somewhere beneath all that melting snow, hidden trails begin waking again. The descent begins beneath clear skies. At dawn, the mountains glow pale gold above the valley, while frost still clings to the remaining snowfields. Water runs steadily through every stream now. The lower trails lie muddy instead of frozen, and scattered patches of green push cautiously through exposed earth beside the rocks. Spring has finally won, at least down here. Higher ridges still shine white against the horizon, cold and distant beneath drifting clouds. Winter never truly disappears from the mountains all at once. It retreats slowly upward, surrendering one slope at a time. The valley stirs with quiet preparation. Ropes coiled, packs tied, fences dismantled. The sheep seem restless already, crowding toward the lower trails as if they too smell warmer grass somewhere beyond the foothills. You stand outside the shelter watching smoke rise into the calm morning air while the old shepherd tightens straps across a mule's pack saddle nearby. Neither of you says much. Words for ye, you're unnecessary now. Seasonal descent marked an important turning point for many medieval pastoral communities. Mountain shelters emptied, trade routes reopened fully, families separated for months reunited in the valleys below. Entire regional economies depended on these annual movements happening successfully. The mountains released people carefully each spring. You begin walking shortly after sunrise. The flock stretches across the trail in long, uneven lines, while bells ring softly through the warming air. Mud clings thickly to your boots. Birds move constantly through the trees now, darting between branches carrying twigs and moss. Everything feels alive again. Even the smell has changed completely. Wet soil, fresh grass, running water, wood smoke drifting upward from distant settlements below. After so many months breathing snow and pine resin, the scent almost overwhelms you. The dogs trot beside the flock with calmer energy than before. No constant growling toward forests now. No frantic circling beneath storm clouds. They still watch carefully. But the sharp edge of winter vigilance has softened. One pauses beside a stream to drink greedily while sunlight glitters across the water. You realize suddenly how exhausted everyone became during the cold months, animals included. Along the lower slopes, old avalanche scars cut through the forest like pale wounds where broken trees still lie tangled beneath melting snow. New grass already pushes through parts of the debris. The mountain destroy, then quietly begin rebuilding. A custom found in several upland communities involved shepherds stopping at small roadside shrines during seasonal descents to give thanks for surviving the winter. Some left coins, others wool, carved tokens, or pieces of bread. After everything you have seen, gratitude feels entirely reasonable. By midday, the flock reaches the old pine forest where winter first swallowed you months earlier. You recognize it instantly. The narrow, frozen stream now rushes freely between dark stones. Snow survives only in shaded patches beneath the trees. The trail itself appears smaller than you remembered, less frightening somehow. Yet echoes remain. You still remember the wolves howling beyond the darkness, the deep snow swallowing your boots, the endless climb beside nervous sheep while the mountains watched silently around you. You were different then. One surviving account written by a medieval traveller described mountain shepherds as people who belonged halfway between wilderness and civilization, not entirely part of either world. The phrase lingers in your mind now while descending through the thawing forest, because you understand it. The valleys ahead feel familiar, but the mountains changed you quietly while nobody watched. Late afternoon sunlight spreads warmly across the lower hills. Villages appear more frequently now beside streams and muddy fields where farmers begin spring planting. Smoke rises from ovens. Children chase one another between cottages. Dogs bark from fenced yards as the flock passes slowly along the road. Ordinary life continues below the peaks. A few villagers pause to stare at the shepherds descending from the mountains. They notice the weathered cloaks, the scarred dogs, the lean, tired sheep carrying winter still tangled in their wool. Mountain people always return looking slightly older than when they left. One elderly woman beside a roadside well crosses herself while watching the flock pass. Perhaps blessing the animals, perhaps blessing the shepherds, perhaps simply grateful she spent winter somewhere with proper walls and dry bread. You cannot blame her. As evening approaches, the road finally widens enough for wagons and regular travellers again. The constant silence of the high ridges fades gradually beneath human sounds. Hammering from distant workshops, church bells, voices drifting across fields. The world feels crowded now. You find yourself missing the mountain quiet already, which would have sounded completely insane to you several months ago. The old shepherd notices your expression. He almost smiles. Almost. There is no dramatic farewell between you when the roads eventually divide near the lower valley. His remaining flock must continue eastward towards summer grazing fields, while yours will stay closer to the western settlements. He simply nods once. The dogs glance back briefly. Then the old shepherd disappears slowly along the muddy road beneath evening light. Bells fading softly behind him. Clunk, clink, clunk, until only silence remains. You continue downward alone beside your flock while smoke rises from nearby farms and twilight spreads across the valleys below. The mountains stand far behind you now, still enormous, still snow-covered, yet somehow quieter than before. And as the first stars appear above the darkening hills, you realize something strange. Part of you already misses the frozen ridges, the storms, the endless white silence, even the lonely bells drifting through fog after dark. Because surviving the mountains does not leave a person unchanged. It settles inside them slowly, like smoke in wool, like winter buried beneath spring snow. The final fire burns quietly beside the edge of the pasture. Spring has settled fully across the lower valleys now. Grass bends softly beneath evening wind while sheep graze lazily nearby beneath fading gold light. The mountains remain visible far beyond the fields, their highest ridges still streaked white with lingering snow. But they feel farther away tonight. Not smaller, never smaller, just distant now. Like something half remembered from a long, difficult dream. You sit beside the fire alone, turning a small stick slowly through the embers. Smoke drifts upward, carrying the familiar scent that followed you all winter through storms, forests and frozen passes. Smoke in wool, smoke in hair. Smoke worked permanently into memory itself. The flock rests peacefully around the pasture. Lambs move awkwardly through the grass while bells sound softly whenever the animals shift. Clunk, clink, gentler now somehow. No desperate storms behind the sound anymore. No avalanches rumbling across hidden ridges. No wolves circling beyond the firelight beneath snow-covered trees. Only evening. Only spring air cooling slowly after sunset. Many medieval shepherds likely returned year after year to the same mountain routes despite the hardship. Families passed grazing knowledge through generations. Children inherited trails, shelters, dogs, and seasonal rhythms older than memory itself. Because difficult lives still become familiar lives, and familiar lives become home, you glance toward the mountains again. From down here they appear beautiful. Soft blue shapes beneath the darkening sky, almost peaceful. The valleys always see mountains differently than the people trapped inside them during winter. A nearby stream murmurs quietly through fresh grass beside the pasture. Frogs sing somewhere near the reeds. Far off, church bells drift faintly across the evening from a village hidden among the hills. Ordinary sounds, human sounds, the kind that disappeared completely during the long frozen months above the tree line. One tiny detail preserved in rural folklore tells of shepherds sometimes refusing to wash their winter cloaks immediately after returning from the mountains, because the smell of smoke and snow supposedly carried good fortune into the warmer seasons. Or perhaps people simply grew attached to the scent of survival. You understand that possibility now. The fire settles lower beside you. Orange embers pulse softly beneath collapsing wood while the last daylight fades from the western horizon. The sheep gather closer together naturally as night approaches, their breathing slow and calm in the cooling air. You realize you no longer count them automatically every few minutes. That habit may fade eventually, or perhaps not. Some traces of the mountains remain permanently once learned. Watching clouds before storms, listening for distant water beneath ice, waking instantly at unusual sounds in darkness. The body remembers difficult seasons carefully. Over the centuries, countless shepherds crossed frozen mountains carrying little more than wool cloaks, simple tools, stubborn animals, and knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Most left no written records behind, no heroic songs, no carved statues and crowded cities, only trails, only stories, only smoke-stained shelters hidden high among the ridges. And yet entire communities survived because those shepherds continued climbing into the cold each winter, despite everything waiting for them there. You sit quietly with that thought while stars begin appearing overhead one by one. The first night insects hum softly through the grass nearby. Warm wind brushes across your face carrying scents of earth and growing things instead of snow. The contrast feels almost impossible now. Still, pieces of winter linger inside your memory with remarkable clarity. The bell sheep leading through the fog, the dogs barking into storms, avalanche thunder shaking the valley, the old shepherd silently watching weather move across the peaks, and perhaps strongest of all, the silence itself. That deep, endless mountain silence filled with snowlight and distant wolves and frozen forests breathing beneath the stars. You understand now why people told stories about those places for centuries. The mountains change anyone who stays long enough. The fire burns lower still. Beyond the pasture, darkness settles gently across the valley, while windows begin glowing warm in distant farmhouses. Somewhere nearby, a child laughs briefly before being called indoors for the night. Life continues, quietly. Ordinarily, the sheep settle fully now, bells falling sonant one by one across the grass. You lean back slightly, feeling the warmth of the fading fire against your hands while cool spring air drifts through the fields around you. And slowly, very slowly, the world grows softer. The mountains darken into shadow beneath the stars. The pasture becomes silver beneath moonlight. The stream continues murmuring beside the grass in patient, endless rhythm. You breathe deeply once more. Smoke. Earth. Spring water, far away now. Beyond countless ridges and forests and melting snowfields, the high mountain trails sleep quietly beneath the night sky, waiting for another winter, another flock, another shepherd listening to bells through the dark, and here beside the last gentle fire of the season, with warm earth beneath you and peaceful animals breathing softly nearby, your own long journey through the frozen mountains finally comes to rest. The embers dim. The wind softens, the bells fall silent, and little by little, the night carries everything gently into stillness. Sweet dreams.